Thank you.
So please don't start off with standing. We have somebody singing the national anthem tonight? No.
Only the first night. You guys ready? Please come to order. Okay, couple of quick plugs here, and then we'll do the Pledge of Allegiance. The Walpole TV Media is pleased to be providing live coverage of tonight's town meeting on Comcast Channel 22 and Verizon Channel 30. Live streaming of this meeting is also available on YouTube by going to the Walpole Media channel. And you can watch the replay of this meeting anytime by going to the website walpolemedia.tv and clicking the on-demand button. I'd also like to just remind folks that on Monday, May 21st, the League of Women Voters will be presenting the annual Spring Candidates Night at the community room in the Walpole Public Library. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. Okay, we do have a quorum. Meant to mention that before. I just want to go back and confirm the tellers briefly. Are all the tellers still here from the prior night and willing to continue in that role? John Labardi, you here? Ed Forsberg, thank you. John Leith, I see. Mark Gallivan. Mr. Laurent and Mr. Buckley, thank you. One other quick note I wanted to make with respect to time limits. I want to thank Susan Murphy on her point of order. Very eloquently done. I believe that's the way it should be done. If you think you're over, rather than shouting out, call a point of order. I will miss things occasionally. I'm doing a lot. I am trying to keep accurate time. So if you feel that I've exceeded that egregiously, call a point of order. I'd also like to thank Mr. Salvatore, who stood up and when I called Mr. Abbott's time and asked for an extension. That's exactly the way you can do it. And then this body votes. It's the body that decides to extend, not me. I just made a proposal. And the speaker themselves, it didn't happen, the speaker themselves may ask for an extension of the body, through me obviously, and we'll do a quick vote. So that's in your hands, it's not my hands. So I just want to remind everybody of that. One final matter, and this will be the last matter, I apologize. We have a new member from a caucus for Precinct 6. Levitt Dunham, please. Welcome, Mr. Dunham, for the town meeting. Levitt, I'm going to make you stand. Levitt, please, thank you. Okay, so we're on. We are going to start with Article 8, which is where we left off. It is regularly moved and seconded that the following sums be appropriated to the Water Enterprise Fund and expended under the direction of the Department of Public Works for the purpose of operating the Water Department in fiscal year 2019. Personnel services, $974,793. Expenses, $1,617,324. Debt service, $1,848,391. Capital outlay, $317,500. And that the sum of $4,758,009 be raised as follows. User fees, $4,003,709. I didn't say $4,003,709, excuse me. Retained earnings, $317,500. Miscellaneous receipts and MW Pat, $436,800. This is a petition of the Sewer and Water Commissioners. Mr. Stas, the Finance Committee vote. One sec, yeah, your mic didn't. Keep trying.
Can you hear me now?
There you go.
Hey, how are you? Favorable action, 1300.
Thank you, Mr. Stas. Mr. Kraus, Board of Selectmen.
4-0.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus. Mr. Brown, Sewer and Water. Oh. Yep, thank you. Mr. Forsberg.
Mr. Moderator, capital budget voted on the capital outlay of $317,500, 500.
Thank you, Mr. Forsberg. Are there any questions with regards to Article 8? There being none, this motion requires a simple majority vote. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? It is a unanimous vote. Article 9, it is regularly moved and seconded that the following sums be appropriated to the Sewer Enterprise Fund and expended under the direction of the Department of Public Works for the purpose of operating the sewer department in fiscal year 2019. Personnel services, $309,599. Expenses, $4,170,000, $895. Debt service, $155,482. Capital outlay, $925,000. And that the sum of $5,560,976 be raised as follows. User fees, $4,275,240. Retained earnings, $1,048,025. And miscellaneous receipts, $237,711. This is a petition of the Sewer and Water Commissioners. Mr. Stas, the Finance Committee vote.
Favorable action, 1300.
Thank you, Mr. Stas. Mr. Kraus, Board of Selectmen.
Favorable action, 4-0.
Mr. Forsberg.
Mr. Moderator, the capital budget voted 500 for the capital outlay of $925,000.
Thank you, Mr. Forsberg. Are there any questions or comments with regards to Article 9? Sorry, Sewer and Water.
5-0.
Thank you, Mr. Hassenjager. Are there any questions or comments with regard to Article 9? There being none, this motion requires a simple majority vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? It is a unanimous vote. Article 10. Water infrastructure improvements. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town appropriates $1,825,000 to pay the costs of design and permitting and construction of water mains, including all incidental and related costs, and to meet this appropriation to transfer $170,000 from available bond sale premium, and to authorize the treasurer with the approval of the Board of Selectmen to borrow $1,655,000 under and pursuant to Mass General Law, Chapter 44, Section 7(1) or Section 8, or pursuant to any other enabling authority, and to issue bonds or notes of the town therefore, and further, that any premium received by the town upon the sale of any bonds or notes approved by this vote, unless any such premium applied to the payment of the cost of issuance of such bonds or notes may be applied to the payment of costs approved by this vote in accordance with Chapter 44, Section 20 of the General Laws, thereby reducing the amount authorized to be borrowed to pay such costs by like amount. This is a petition of the Sewer and Water Commissioners. Mr. Stas, Finance Committee vote.
Favorable action, 902.
Mr. Kraus, Board of Selectmen.
Board of Selectmen voted 4-0-0.
Mr. Forsberg, Capital Budget.
Capital budget voted favorable action 500.
And Mr. Hassenjager. Thank you, Mr. Hassenjager. Are there any questions or comments with regards to Article 10? There being none, this motion requires a 2/3 vote because of borrowing. If all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? It is a unanimous vote. Declare 2/3 vote. Article 11, prior year unpaid bills. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town take no action. This is a petition of the Board of Selectmen. Mr. Stas, Finance Committee vote?
No action, 12-0-0.
Sorry?
No action, 12-0-0.
Thank you, Mr. Stas. Mr. Kraus?
No action, 400.
Any questions or comments with regard to Article 11? There being none, this is a motion for no action and requires a simple majority vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? It is a unanimous vote. That's Article 12, snow and ice deficit. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town transfer the sum of $50,000 from overlay surplus to offset the financial impact of snow and ice deficit in the current fiscal year. This is a petition of the Board of Selectmen. Mr. Stas, the Finance Committee vote?
Favorable action, 12-0-0.
Thank you, Mr. Stas. Mr. Kraus?
Favorable action, 400.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus. Any questions or comments with regard to Article 12? There being none, this motion requires a 2/3 vote. I'm sorry? It's a majority vote, excuse me. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? It is a unanimous vote. Article 13, appropriation to the stabilization fund. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town vote to transfer from free cash the sum of $1,500,000 for the purpose of supplementing the stabilization fund as authorized by Chapter 40, Section 5B of the Massachusetts General Laws. This is a petition of the Board of Selectmen. Mr. Stas, the Finance Committee vote?
Favorable action, 10-0-0.
Thank you, Mr. Stas. Mr. Kraus, Board of Selectmen?
Favorable action, 400.
Are there any questions or comments with regard to Article 13? Mr. Flowers?
Andrew Flowers, Precinct 4, Finance Committee. Just want to make a few quick comments. I supported this article, but I think it really makes sense to think of it as going in tandem with the next article, Article 14, regarding OPEB. So this is a good idea. As Town Administrator Jim Johnson has said, there was lots of feedback last fall about how we use our free cash, and it's good to put some of that money in the stabilization fund. But again, it's really a debate about, do we put this money in stabilization or do we put it towards our OPEB liability? So I'll have more to say about OPEB in the next article. But the current idea here is that Walpole's bond rating is AA+, so it's the second highest. And you look at how much Walpole has in reserves, which includes the stabilization fund as well as some other accounts. And it's about 16% of the town's total debt liability. Well, look at other towns that have AAA bond ratings. How much do they have in reserves? It's about 20 to 30%. So we're getting there, we're close, and so I think this is a great idea. But at this point, I'd be curious to know whether the stabilization fund is adequate, especially given the economy. We're at like an 18-year low in unemployment. It's a good economy. So if things get worse, it's good to have a big stabilization fund. But as for future uses of free cash, is it worth exploring that stabilization is essentially good to go right now? And if we have future free cash, it should go towards OPEB. That's the issue. So just keep that in mind.
Thank you, Mr. Flowers. Any further questions and comments with regards to Article 13? There being none, this motion requires a simple majority vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? It is a unanimous vote. Article 14, appropriation to the OPEB fund. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town vote to transfer from free cash the sum of $50,000 for the purpose of supplementing the fund known as the Other Post-Employment Benefits Liability Trust Fund, OPEB, as authorized by Chapter 32B, Section 20 of the Massachusetts General Laws. This is a petition of the Board of Selectmen. Mr. Stas, the Finance Committee vote.
Favorable action 901.
Thank you, Mr. Stas. Mr. Kraus, Board of Selectmen.
Favorable action 400.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus. Any questions or comments with regards to Article 14? There being none, this motion requires... Whoops, I'm sorry. Mr. Flowers?
Andrew Flowers, Precinct 4. I just want to emphasize that this is an important fiscal issue. It's a problem for this town. We need to do more. That's the second point. And the third point is, this is really important. We're doing better than most Massachusetts towns, and we're on the right trajectory. So there's no reason for alarm. Think of it as an analogy of like a mortgage, right? Our actuarial unfunded liability, when we discussed this on Monday, is $41 million. But if you think about how much we pay per year, just in a pay-go terms, it's about $2 million. And how much would we need to pay, the actual annual required contribution to make that zero over 30 years? It's about $3.3 million. Well, we fund, in addition to the pay-go, we fund about $350,000, right? $300,000 in the budget as a line item. That's what we discussed, and Mr. Pittman, I believe, in RTM brought this up on Monday, and then we add an additional $50,000. So we have about $1 million more we should be putting towards OPEB per year. If I understand Dan Sherman from Sherman Actuarial Services, he's the OPEB actuary who came before the Finance Committee. So think of that number, $1 million per year. But, and I want to quote him here, you don't have to do it all in one shot. So he just recommends that as long as we keep this number going up higher every year. So this is just a modest proposal of maybe an additional $50,000 or $100,000 per year over the next 10 to 20 years will get us to the level where we're actually going to make this a non-issue completely. Again, this is not going to be overnight. It's going to be over a few decades. And so, yeah, just keep in mind that this needs to go higher going forward, but it's not a crisis of any sort.
Thank you, Mr. Flowers. Mr. Hamilton?
Hamilton, Precinct 5. It wasn't that long ago that our credit rating dropped because we weren't putting enough into OPEB. And I thought we were going to put more into OPEB, and $50,000 doesn't seem to be a step that we could be doing a little bit more. And I was hoping we would be doing a little bit more. And at town meeting a few years back, we said we'd do more. I hope next year we'll do more. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Ms. Lawson?
This is Lawson, Precinct 2. Through you to Jim Johnson.
Can you turn the
I'm
mic
sorry.
up a little bit?
I'm
Yeah,
sorry. Through you to Jim. Is it true or not true that our credit rating was lowered because we failed to make payments into OPEB? I don't believe that the prior speaker stated the record correctly.
We changed credit rating bureaus. We went to Moody's, and OPEB is something relatively new. We just started it in 2000. The spring of 2011 was our first contribution, which was $100,000. We're up to 200. Before this town meeting, we were at $2,855,000. Now, I'll remind you that as part of the insurance line item, about 2-3 years ago, we started to put $300,000 aside each year as a regular budget item. We also tend to put $100,000 to $300,000 aside each town meeting in the fall. So this is supplemental to the town meeting funds that we've put in there, to the budget, and this is just a little extra that we will put aside.
Through you, Mr. Moderator, my question is, Mr. Hamilton just made a statement that our credit rating was reduced.
Our credit rating has not been changed.
I just wanted to correct the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kellman. Ms. Lawson? Any further questions or comments with respect to Article 14? There being none, this motion requires a simple majority vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? It is a unanimous vote. Article 15, dispatcher contract. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town vote to approve the monetary items in an agreement between the town of Walpole and the Massachusetts Coalition of Police, AFL-CIO Local 466, Walpole Public Safety Dispatchers, and to raise and appropriate from taxation the sum of $33,500 to defray the cost of said agreement for the period July 1, 2018 to June 30, 2019. This is a petition of the Board of Selectmen. Mr. Stas, the Finance Committee vote.
Favorable action 1300.
Favorable 1300. Thank you, Mr. Stas. Mr. Kraus?
Board of Selectmen voted favorable action 311.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus. Any questions or comments with regards to Article 15? There being none, this motion requires a simple majority vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? It is a vote. Article 16, firefighter contract. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town vote to approve the monetary items in an agreement between the town of Walpole and the Walpole Permanent Firefighters Association, and to transfer from account number, you can read it as well as I can, the sum of $35,000 to defray the cost of said agreement for the period July 1st, 2017 to June 30th, 2018. And furthermore, to raise and appropriate from taxation the sum of $132,800 to defray the cost of said agreement for the period July 1, 2018 to June 30th, 2019. This is a petition of the Board of Selectmen. Mr. Stas, the Finance Committee vote.
Favorable action 1300.
Thank you, Mr. Stas. Mr. Kraus, Board of Selectmen.
Favorable action 500.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus. Any questions or comments with respect to Article 16? There being none, this requires a simple majority vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? It is a unanimous vote. Article 17, capital infrastructure improvements. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town vote to appropriate the sum of $235,000 from free cash to implement a capital improvement program to protect, improve, and or modify the physical infrastructure, including but not limited to municipal buildings, facilities, parking lots, fields, and other properties of the town of Walpole as listed in the spring 2018 capital budget for Article 17 under the column entitled FinCom Recom. And further, that the Board of Selectmen is authorized to take any other action necessary or convenient to carry out these projects. This is a petition of the Board of Selectmen. Mr. Stas, the Finance Committee vote.
Favorable action 1200.
Thank you, Mr. Stas. Mr. Kraus, the Board of Selectmen.
Favorable action 500.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus. And Mr. Forsberg, Capital Budget.
Capital Budget voted favorable action 500.
Thank you, Mr. Forsberg. Are there any questions and comments with regards to Article 17? There being none, this motion contains borrowing, so it requires a 2/3 vote. It's free cash, I apologize. It requires a majority vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? It is a unanimous vote. Capital equipment. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town vote to appropriate the sum of $1,174,855 from the ambulance funds in free cash for the purchase and equipping of capital equipment, including but not limited to vehicles, machinery, and computer network systems for the various departments of the town of Walpole, all as more specifically set forth in the spring 2018 capital budget for Article 18 under the columns entitled Funding Source and FinCom Recom. And further, that the Board of Selectmen is authorized to take any other action necessary or convenient to carry out these projects. This is a petition of the Board of Selectmen. Mr. Stas, the Finance Committee vote.
Favorable action, 12-0.
Thank you, Mr. Stas. Mr. Kraus, Board of Selectmen.
Favorable action, 500. And through you, Mr. Moderator, if I can just say a couple comments.
Absolutely.
I think we'd be remiss, and the DPW is a part of this article and the next article as well. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge the incredible efforts of the DPW this past winter season. We had horrific storms, weather patterns that we haven't seen in decades, and we felt that they did an extraordinary job keeping our town as safe as possible and our buildings as clean as possible, and I just wanted to acknowledge that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus. Mr. Forsberg, Capital Budget.
Favorable action, 500.
Thank you, Mr. Forsberg. Are there any questions or comments with regards to Article 18? Mr. O'Leary.
John O'Leary, Precinct 3. There's a couple of line items to you, Mr. Moderator, I'd like an explanation on. One is under the Parks Department, replacing a tractor. From my memory, didn't we just buy that 2 years ago? Why are we needing to replace it a couple already?
Mr. Johnson.
Sure. I believe the machine you're thinking of is the aerator, which was, yes, it was recently purchased a few years back. That is to maintain the ball fields. This is a tractor. I believe that purchase was for 18 to 23,000. This is a much larger tractor. I believe that's the older Kubota that's going to be replaced there.
My second question is under the school department. There's a listing for 100,000 for technology, Chromebooks, and tech switches. Could someone explain what that involves?
Mr. Frisha.
The capital line item for $160,000 represents Chromebooks, 450 Chromebooks for the high school, 300 for the middle school, a total of 750. And that will complete the one-to-one initiatives from grade 7 to grade 12. The additional 10,000 is for switches that coincide with the introduction of these Chromebooks and the increased demand on the network that provides the service for these devices.
Thank you. No further.
Thank you, Mr. O'Leary. Any other questions or comments with regards to Article 18? There being none, this motion requires a simple majority vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? It is a unanimous vote. Article 19, borrowing for facility improvements. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town vote to appropriate the sum of $2,700,000 for the infrastructure. Thank you. The sum of $2,765,000 for infrastructure improvements, all as more specifically set forth in the spring 2018 capital budget for Article 19 under the column entitled FinCom Recom, and to meet this appropriation to authorize the treasurer with the approval of the Board of Selectmen to borrow the sum of $2,765,000 pursuant to the provisions of General Law, Chapter 44, Section 7, or any other enabling authority, and to issue bonds and notes therefore, and further, that the Board of Selectmen is authorized to take any other action necessary or convenient to carry out these projects, and that any premium received upon the sale of any bonds or notes approved by this vote, less any such premium applied to the payment of the costs of issuance of such bonds or notes in accordance with Chapter 44, Section 20 of the General Laws, thereby reducing the amount authorized to be borrowed to pay such costs by a like amount. Provided further, however, that the Board of Selectmen may, for all or a portion of the infrastructure improvements authorized hereunder, instead enter into an energy savings performance contract, including any related lease purchase agreements for such terms which may exceed 3 years, and such other terms and conditions as the board shall determine to be in the best interests of the town. This is a petition of the Board of Selectmen. Mr. Stas, the Finance Committee vote.
Favorable action, 12-0-0.
Thank you, Mr. Stas. Mr. Kraus, Board of Selectmen.
Favorable action, 500.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus. And Mr. Forsberg, Capital Budget.
Favorable action, 500.
Thank you, Mr. Forsberg. Are there any questions or comments with regard to Article 19? Mr. O'Leary.
John O'Leary, Precinct 3. Through you, Mr. Moderator, could someone provide additional details on the Old Post Road infrastructure improvements? What type of improvements or the nature of such improvements?
Mr. Johnson.
Sure. Specifically, we're going to be looking to do boilers, windows, and roof improvements on that school. You may recall that a few years ago, we undertook that at the Fisher School. It was quite successful. We've done it also more recently at the Johnson Middle School, and we're looking to continue that here.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson.
And through you, Mr. Moderator, could someone explain some of the terminology in the last 3 or 4 lines of that, the article, which didn't seem to be in the article booklet?
Town Council?
Sure.
Okay.
We actually added that on. The premium language there is part of the Municipal Modernization Act, so we can use a premium that's, on the last projects, we realized a few $100,000 on those premiums, and that allowed us to borrow less when we went out to borrow. And as far as the energy language there, that's something that's relatively new too on the Municipal Modernization Act on the municipal side. That will allow us to work with the company to come in and ensure that we are actually going to be realize the maximum savings as part of these replacements there, and work with them to make sure that we're going to have green buildings here as green as possible. So.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Leary. Any further questions or comments with regards to Article 19? There being none, this motion contains borrowing, so it requires a 2/3 vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? It is unanimous vote. I declare 2/3 vote. Article 20, revolving funds. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town vote to approve Article 20 as printed in the warrant. This is a pretty extensive article if you want to take a look at it. Mr. Stas, the Finance Committee vote.
Favorable action, 9-0-0.
Thank you, Mr. Stas. Mr. Kraus, Board of Selectmen.
Favorable action, 500.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus. Are there any questions or comments with regard to Article 20? Mr. Chekarowski.
Philip Shaharofsky, Precinct 7. Through you, Mr. Moderator, just have a question of what the revenue source for the net metering is, what buildings or...
Mr. Johnson?
Yes, it's actually the Old Bird machine down in South Walpole. You may recall that maybe 3 years ago, this body authorized us to enter into a net metering credit and a pilot program for that facility. And we're finally, the facility's up and running after a few years, and the town's able to realize some funds from that. So that's where we're at.
And through you, Mr. Moderator, I'm curious about the library has solar panels. So are we getting renewable energy credits from those solar panels?
We are getting a modest credit on that one. It's such a small area, but yes, we are. And I believe there's a display screen in the children's area that shows when it's up and running what we're actually realizing for credits.
And through you, Mr. Moderator, is that revenue showed in the library's budget or in the town budget?
I believe it's so modest. It's as part of our general local receipts. It's a few thousand at the most. So.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chekarowski. Mr. Abbott.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Bill Abbott, Precinct 6. Just a question, the last item, vehicles and equipment, since we seem to appropriate that replacement of vehicles. That's curious. It's a new item.
Mr. Johnson.
Yes, this is a new item. It's something that recently came up. I was attending a conference, and I was approached by a vendor, and some other towns are doing this. Instead of actually trading in the vehicles and getting maybe $8,000 to $10,000 for a loader or something like this, this will allow us to actually go out to a company like MuniBid or Bid Gov Direct, one of those companies, and have them bid it out, surplus it out for us, and we can actually take in the funds and stick it in that account and have town meeting reappropriate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Abbott. Any further questions or comments with regard to Article 20? There being none, this motion requires a simple majority vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? It is a unanimous vote. Article 21, the Walpole Media Corporation fiscal year 2019 operating budget. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town vote pursuant to General Law, Chapter 44, Section 53F and 3/4, to appropriate from the PEG Access and Cable Related Fund the sum of $467,504 as a grant to the Walpole Media Corporation to operate the Walpole Cable Access and PEG channels for fiscal year 2019. This is a petition of the Board of Selectmen. Mr. Stas, the Finance Committee vote.
Favorable action, 11-0-0.
11?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Kraus, the Board of Selectmen.
Favorable action, 5-0-0.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus. Are there any questions or comments with regard to Article 21? There being none, this motion requires a simple majority vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? It is a unanimous vote. Article 22, Industrial Road Land Authorization for Sale. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town vote pursuant to General Law, Chapter 40, Section 15A, to transfer the care, custody, and control of the parcels of town-owned land shown on Assessor's Map 46 as lots 63, 65, and 66, located on Industrial Road and Main Street, from the Board of Selectmen or other board or other officer currently having custody thereof for the purposes for which said parcels are held to the Board of Selectmen for the purpose of conveyance, and to authorize the Board of Selectmen to convey said parcels in accordance with the provisions of General Law, Chapter 30B, Section 16, the Uniform Procurement Act, on such terms and conditions and for such consideration which may be nominal consideration as the board deems appropriate, and further to authorize the Board of Selectmen to execute any and all documents reasonably necessary to effectuate the purposes of this article. This is a petition of the Board of Selectmen. Mr. Stas, the Finance Committee vote.
Favorable action, 9-0-0.
Thank you, Mr. Stas. Mr. Kraus, the Board of Selectmen.
Favorable action, 5-0-0.
The Planning Board vote. This is... It does not need the Planning Board? Okay, thank you. Are there any questions or comments with regard to Article 22? There being none, so this requires a 2/3 vote because it is a change to the zoning bylaw, right? No? Sale of property, thank you. Land transfer, thank you. So this requires a 2/3 vote because it is a land transfer. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? It is a unanimous vote. I declare 2/3 vote. The High Street Water Tower lease. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town vote pursuant to General Law, Chapter 40, Section 15A, to transfer the care, custody, maintenance, and control of the town-owned land shown on Assessor's Map 7, Parcel 18, and located on High Street, from the board or officer currently having such care, custody, maintenance, and control for the purpose for which it is currently held, including the maintenance and operation of a water tower, to such board or other or officer for its current purpose, and to the Board of Selectmen for the purpose of leasing a portion or portions of said property in accordance with the provisions of General Law, Chapter 30B, Section 16, the Uniform Procurement Act, for the development thereon of a wireless telecommunications facility, and further to authorize the Board of Selectmen to enter into such a lease or leases for said purposes for all or a portion of said land, upon such terms and conditions, and for a period in excess of 3 years, as the Board of Selectmen shall determine to be in the best interest of the town, and to grant such easements upon said land as are necessary for utility services in support of such use, and further to authorize the Board of Selectmen to execute any and all documents reasonably necessary to effectuate the purposes of this article. This is a petition of the Board of Selectmen. Mr. Stas, the Finance Committee vote.
Favorable action, 1300.
Mr. Kraus, Board of Selectmen.
Favorable action, 400.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus. Are there any questions or comments with regards to Article 23? There being none, this motion requires a 2/3 vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? It is a unanimous vote. I declare 2/3 vote. Article 24, Senior Tax Exemption Age Extension. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town vote pursuant to Clause 41C of Chapter 59, Section 5 of the Massachusetts General Laws to reduce the age from 70 to 65 years old at which certain qualifying seniors will be eligible for the tax exemption set forth therein. This is a petition of the Board of Selectmen. Mr. Stas, the Finance Committee vote.
Favorable action, 900.
Thank you, Mr. Stas. Mr. Kraus, Board of Selectmen.
Favorable action, 500.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus. Are there any questions or comments with regard to Article 24?
Hi, I'm Dave Clark, Precinct 7. I have a couple questions on this. Probably for you, Mr. Moderator, I think to the administrator, town administrator. So how many households currently qualify the exemption, and what is the total tax exemption for that group?
Mr. Johnson.
I'd look to the Board of Assessors on this one to help me out, but currently there are 25 applicants on this one. The extension starts at, the exemption starts at $1,000 and goes up to $1,500. If this exemption passes, it will go up to $1,750. So the additional impact to the town will be $6,250 off the books. So
Per $6,250 per?
yeah.
But approximately what number of people claim that now, and what number will claim it when if and when the age is reduced from 70 to 65? How many people are we talking about that would be?
Mr. Johnson.
I can just tell you what the current number of people are, and I don't know how many people that would impact. It's currently 25.
So no one has an answer to that question?
I'm not sure if, I assume that other people are going to apply for this.
Well,
I just
yeah,
don't know what that number is going to be.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just curious about what the net change in revenue is, and if it's substantial to the town. That's what I'm wondering. So.
That's what I have right here.
Okay. I'm not against this. I'm just wondering, usually when we make changes like this, we have some sense of what the change is to the town revenue, because I'll probably have the same question on Article 26.
Well, when we get to Article 26, we'll ask that, Mr. Clark.
Okay, well, I've got the question with this one. Usually, something like this was a change in net revenue. We have some idea of what that change is. It seems like no one's offering approximately what the revenue change is.
Understood, Mr. Clark.
Okay.
There he is.
Do you have
Thank
an
you.
answer, Dennis?
Thank you.
Mr. Fliss will answer as best he can.
Yes. Good evening. Dennis Fliss, Director of Assessing. Through you, Mr. Moderator. We currently have 25 people in that program, 41C. The total exemptions for that amount is $37,177. At this time, we have no idea how many more people will apply, but each applicant will add an additional $1,000.
Okay. Thank you
Okay.
very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fliss. Don't go too far. Thank you, Mr. Clark. Are there any further questions or comments with regard to Article 24? There being none, this motion requires a simple majority vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? It is a unanimous vote. Article 25. It is a blind person exemption. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town vote to accept the provisions of Chapter 59, Section 5, Clause 37A of the Massachusetts General Laws, which section authorized an exemption of $500 for blind persons who are legal residents of the Commonwealth and of the town, thereby increasing the amount of the exemption from the current amount, $437.50. This is a petition of the Board of Selectmen. Mr. Stas, Finance Committee vote.
Favorable action, 900.
Thank you, Mr. Stas. Mr. Kraus, Board of Selectmen.
Favorable action, 500.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus. Are any questions or comments with regard to Article 25? There being none, this requires a simple majority vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? It is a unanimous vote. Article 26, Personal Tax Exemption. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town vote to amend the additional real estate tax exemption granted pursuant to Massachusetts General Laws, God bless you, Chapter 59, Section 5C and a half, to taxpayers who are granted personal exemptions on their domiciles under Mass General Laws, Chapter 59, Section 5, including certain blind persons, disabled veterans, surviving spouses, and seniors, to provide an additional exemption of up to 75% of the personal exemption, to be effective for exemptions granted for any fiscal year beginning on or after July 1st, 2018. This is a petition of the Board of Selectmen. Mr. Stas, the Finance Committee vote.
Favorable, 801.
Thank you, Mr. Stas. Mr. Kraus, the Board of Selectmen.
Favorable action, 500.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus. Any questions or comments with regard to Article 26? There being none, this motion requires a simple majority vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? It is a unanimous vote. Thank you, Mr. Fliss. If you had left, they would have had questions. Article 27, Speed Limit Establishment. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town vote to accept the provisions of Mass General Laws, Chapter 90, Section 17C, to allow the Board of Selectmen to establish a speed limit of 25 miles per hour in a thickly settled or business district in the town that is not a state highway. This is a petition of the Board of Selectmen. Mr. Stas, the Finance Committee vote.
Favorable, 10-1-0.
Thank you, Mr. Stas. Mr. Kraus, the Board of Selectmen.
Favorable action, 401.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus. Any questions? Mr. Fasanello.
Fasanello, Precinct 3. A question I have is that thickly settled areas are, I guess, within a quarter mile if the houses are less than 200 feet apart. And I understand that would happen, it makes sense to have a 25-mile-an-hour speed limit in a, let's say, neighborhood. But would this, my question is, would this also apply to, let's say, Washington Street, where the houses in most places are within 200 feet of each other, which is a, rather large street? That's my question. In that type of a street, there's other streets in the town that are also wide that would be technically thickly settled.
Chief Carmichael?
Thought I was going to skirt through this without getting up here. So basically, in Walpole, anywhere where you see currently where there are posted speed limit signs, it wouldn't apply because those signs have been there basically since back in the 60s and 70s when the Department of Transportation and the town of Walpole did traffic studies to determine that. So those fall under 9018. So essentially, Common Street, Fisher Street in certain areas, Route 1, 1A, those are state highways obviously, Washington Street, anywhere where you see those posted speed limits, those would not be affected by this because they're done under 9018 and not under 9017. Does that answer the question?
Through you, Mr. Moderator, would it be fair to say that if a street has a yellow line down the middle, it would not come under the 25-mile-an-hour speed limit regulation?
No, the only time the 25-mile-an-hour speed limit would fall into place is in a thickly settled or in a business district that is not covered under 9018. So if it's not posted, then those areas where it's thickly settled, meaning how you just described it, quarter of a mile if the houses are closer than 200 feet apart, then it would be reduced down to 25. So currently, everywhere in Walpole that's thickly settled or is in a business district is 30. So all we would be doing is reducing that speed limit in those particular areas.
Thank you.
Yep. Welcome.
Hello, Audrey Grace, Precinct 6. What is so in these new districts where the signs aren't posted, are you going to post signs, and what would be the cost to the town to post those signs and to enforce the new speed limits and to advertise the new speed limits to the town?
Chief?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
The two, Massachusetts has two speed laws. One is under 9017 and one is under 9018. All of the speed limits under 9017 are designated as 30 miles an hour in thickly settled in business districts. It turns to 40 miles an hour anywhere where it's an undivided highway. So technically, like, believe it or not, Winter Street between the Norfolk line and Main Street is technically a 40-mile-an-hour zone because that's how it was designated. 50 mile an hour in a divided highway situation, which I don't think we have. Well, Route 1 is a divided highway, but it's not. It's actually posted under 9018. Then the second law is 9018, and that's where the state has come in and they have done traffic studies and they've come up with a speed limit that they designated for that particular area. So Route 27 from the Medfield line basically all the way to the Sharon line is all under 9018. And you'll notice that when you drive down Route 27, the speed limits fluctuate. They change, and even if you have a GPS, you'll see that change on there. Those were all done under 9018. 9017, we don't post it. They're just already designated. So if you're in a thickly settled business district, the speed limit is 30. This would reduce it to 25. So no, we wouldn't like inundate the town with all more speed limit signs. We would leave it as it is. Under 9018 would be posted, and under 9017 it would be just how it is now. That makes sense.
It does. Can I, through you, Mr. Moderator, may I ask a follow-up question? So what would be the cost of enforcing this new speed limit? I'm thinking specifically if other towns are 30 when they drive into Walpole on these roads.
Oh, yes. Good question. If you pass this tonight, we won't be out on Common Street running radar. We would make sure that, you know, using social media, and you have to post it at the beginning of the town when you're entering the town. So they have to, you know, motorists have to know that Walpole accepted the Municipal Modernization Act, and that we have these different speed limits here. And, you know, there would be a learning curve. There would be a time that we would do everything we can to make sure we inform the community. You have to notify the Department of Transportation who posts it. And I believe Dedham just did it this month. So there's other communities around here that are doing it. Boston, I think, was the first one to do it.
Thank you, Ms. Grace. Mr. Leith?
Thank you, John Leith, Precinct 1. Just following up on what Chief said about Dedham just passing this, that is true. My wife is a teacher in Dedham, and two of her class of her students were late to tests that they had last week because their parents were stopped for speeding, going over 25 miles an hour. They were going about 30 miles an hour. Now, when it was passed in Dedham, there was talk of sort of a breaking in time, and I'm sure there was, that people would be warned. I guess, so I'm the one who voted against this. And the reason I voted against this is because I think that 30 is fine. In fact, I would challenge many people in the town and ask them, do they actually go only 30 miles an hour? And I would guess that the answer to that question is no, that many people, in fact, I know many people go more than 30 miles an hour. I think it's confusing to have two different standards. I think it's very confusing to have two different standards, especially if one of them is 25 miles an hour and there aren't signs that are marked to say 25 miles an hour. I'm all for safety. That's not really my concern. I would also say to you, if and when you agree to this, when you go home tonight, please travel at 25 miles an hour and ask yourself whether that really makes sense. And I guess I'm not trying to be critical of anyone, but I think the question should be, do we really need two different standards? How do you know when you're in the 30 or in the 25, really, if it's not marked? And it just seems to me it's more a question of enforcement. If 30 is a safe speed, then let's enforce 30. But I think going down to 25 it confuses matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Leith. Mr. Johnson?
Robinson?
Robinson, I should know that. Sorry, John.
Right. Mr. Moderator, through you to the chief. So this is a change, a blanket change of all areas that are currently 9017 in the town. There isn't any targeted areas. All areas that are not posted will now be 25.
Yes, they do allow the option to pick and choose streets, but that would cause a lot more confusion. So this way, the DOT recommends that you do it as a blanket approach, so if you're going to change it. And it doesn't amend all of Chapter 9017, it just amends the 9017 and the first speed limit being the 30 and the thickly settled in the business district.
Do you have an estimate the percentage of streets in town that would be affected by this?
Yeah, so essentially, like, if, you know, areas that are like subdivisions, and again, like not streets like Common Street, not streets like Route 27, state highways aren't included. Anywhere where you currently see posted speed limit signs wouldn't be affected. It would be the other areas that, you know, like I said, subdivisions where it's thickly settled, and any business districts where you know, it's dedicated just to commercial and business areas.
Do we have any business districts that are not currently posted?
Chief?
Well, the center
As an
of town,
example.
the center of town technically is, you know, you're on a state highway, but when you come into the business district, you're technically, you're in the town of Walpole.
Okay.
So, you know, like the center of Walpole would actually be 25 instead of 30. And then the other issue is the safety zones, which in Walpole, we have a lot of areas that have a lot of really sharp curves, And I'll give you an example. Common Street, as you're going up towards Route 1, very sharp curves. The Board of Selectmen would have the ability to designate safety zones and post that at 20 miles an hour. So we could post
And
that.
Chief, just to be straight, that's a separate article,
Oh,
right?
yeah, I'm sorry.
Yep.
Sorry. Right.
Okay.
So.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. Mr. Hamilton.
Hamilton Precinct 5. I speak in favor of this. People who complain about cars speeding in their neighborhood, a lot of the times when those cars are monitored, they're actually only doing 30. But this would reduce it to 25, making them more happy, and it would really put a slowdown on the cars that were going more than 30, like going 35 or 40. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Mr. Pila.
Pila, Precinct 7. To you, Mr. Moderator. Chief Carmichael, what had precipitated this recommendation? Was there several more accidents or occurrences that...
Good question. Well, the first night of town meeting, if the number one issue that people come up to me and ask and talk about is speeding. And you know, obviously, Walpole, we have a lot of issues that are going on, but speeding is an issue in all of our neighborhoods, and I think that it's something that it concerns everybody, especially with our kids walking around playing in the neighborhood. So it's not something that I felt is something for me to push on the town. I felt that the governor passed the act, and I felt that I had an obligation to offer it to the town as an option. And you know, you have to opt into this law, you don't opt out, so I figured the best way would be to present this to town meeting and let you decide.
Thank you, sir.
Any further questions or comments? There being none, this motion requires a simple majority vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? No. I'm going straight to a standing count. Not going to try that one again. Tellers, please rise. Tellers in favor, please raise your hand. Mr. I'm missing one over here. Lombardi. Mr. Lombardi? Huh? Did he leave? Would somebody in this section over here stand for Mr. Lombardi? Is it Mr. Hegler? Thank you, Mr. Hegler. The tellers in favor, please raise your hand. Ms. Lawson? That is correct. You're correct. Mr. Leith, we'll need a replacement for Mr. Leith in the tellers. Thank you, Mr. O'Leary. Tellers, please raise your hand if you're in favor of the article. So 2. Tellers opposed, please raise your hand. Thank you. All those in favor of the article, please rise and remain standing. Please come down to the microphones when you have your count conferred. Mr. Forsberg.
The right side voted 4 in favor.
You're actually the left, my left side. That's what I'm going with.
Okay,
4
I'm
in
sorry.
favor?
Yes, that's it.
Mr. Gallivan, the center?
In the center, we had 15.
15. And Mr. LaRun?
15.
15. Please be seated, and would those opposed please rise? I'm going to say the people that said yay, were very loud. Do I have to continue this, or can I just call this a misstanding? You may. I have to? I'm going to call it. You may be seated. The motion did not pass. It was a majority opposed. So it has been defeated. Thank you. Article 28, the safety zone exemption. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town and the town vote to accept the provisions of the Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 90, Section 18B, to allow the Board of Selectmen to establish designated safety zones with a speed limit of 20 miles per hour on, at, or near any way in the town that is not a state highway, and if a state highway, with the approval of the Department of Transportation. This is a petition of the Board of Selectmen. Mr. Stas, the Finance Committee vote.
Favorable, 11-0-0.
Thank you, Mr. Stas. Mr. Kraus, the Board of Selectmen.
Favorable action 5-0-0.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus. Any questions or comments with regard to Article 28? Yes, Ms. Grace.
Audrey Grace, Precinct 6. This is for safety zones on the state, for not state highways, but if a state highway, with the approval of Department of Transportation. Being someone who lives on a state highway where people go way too fast, my neighbors have been fighting with the Department of Transportation to get down the speed limit on 1A. So I'm wondering how much movement they have been willing to give towns to reduce the speed limit on 1A, which also has a passing lane, which is ridiculous to me too.
Chief Carmichael.
So your question is, can we change the speed limit on 1A?
I'm asking how willing the Department of Transportation has been to work with the town to reduce speed limits on state highways.
Yeah, I see. So we would have to, the DOT would have to come in, they'd have to work with the town engineers, and they'd have to do a traffic study. The problem with doing those is many times when they do them, and I caution people on certain streets that are posted currently, is they have been known to come in and actually raise the speed limit. So,
excuse me, Chief Carmichael, is this under, this wouldn't fall under the safety zone, correct?
You can still, either under either one of these, you could still amend, you could still take action to change speed limits, but you would still have to go through the proper channels, through the DOT to do that. So you'd have to still do the traffic studies.
So through you, Mr. Moderator, which roads would this article impact?
This one here would be,
Chief Carmichael, go ahead.
This one here would more concentrate on areas that probably our safety officer would make recommendations. Certain areas that, like I just mentioned, Common Street, when you're going up towards Route 1, that's a very sharp curve. The speed limit is actually 35, but there's no real warning of dropping that speed limit down to 20 when you're approaching that intersection, you're approaching that curve. So that would be an area you could designate as a safety zone. Other areas, it would take some time to establish it, but we would probably base it on crash data and any other issues that we're having. North Street's another area. It's very windy. There might be areas or stretches in there where we might have high crashes, or where you're just coming up on very sharp curves that we should create a safety zone in there and make it down to 20. Another example is our current school zones. When you're, as an example, is Route 27, where the Elm Street School is. We designate that as a school zone, but it's technically not. That's covered under 9018. It's posted. So we would be able to, East Street behind Bird Middle is another area. The only time we can designate a school safety zone is when it's on the main driveway that's leading out onto the main street. So that's another area that we could designate as a safety zone. So there's certain areas, and you know, that would be the time when we would maybe give crash data or just look at the dangerousness of it. We could look at site distances and that kind of thing, and then make recommendations to the Board of Selectmen to decide.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Ms. Grace. Ms. Regusta.
Ann Regusta, Precinct 3. Through you, Mr. Moderator. Chief, I wasn't at the Board of Selectmen meeting when this article was discussed. You partially answered my question, but is it correct that there's no, or is there any established criteria at this moment to designate a safety zone? What is a safety zone?
Oh, so the question is there certain criteria to do it?
Correct.
No, essentially what it does, it gives the Board of Selectmen, as the road commissioners, the authority to do it instead of the state. So anywhere other than in those posted areas that we talked about that a citizen or the police bring to the board, you could decide based on whatever criteria, whether it be you want to look at crash data, you want to look at sight distance, or just the radius of a curve that you're coming up on. You could look at anything.
Okay. I think it's important because when there isn't established criteria at the time that an article is passed, something like this, I think that it's very vague and gray, so it may not be prudent at this time without an established criteria what would designate a safety zone. My concern, again, with the Article 27 is there'd not be enough clarity without postings for people coming into town or for speeding. So that would just be my concern with this article. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Regusta. Ms. Ahigian.
Hi, Megan Ahigian, Precinct 1. Through you, Mr. Moderator, is there a plan to display signage for these safety zones?
Yes, we would have to do signs for the safety zones, yeah. That would be the whole purpose, you know, like I said, North Street, you would come down and it's almost a warning saying this area, this stretch of road is going to be 20 miles an hour. So those areas would be posted.
Thank you.
Thank you, Thank you, Chief Carmichael. Any further questions or comments on Article 28? There being none, this motion requires a simple majority vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? No. The ayes have it. Article 29, Lavender Lane Street Acceptance. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town vote to accept Lavender Lane from its beginning to its end, including any easements and utilities appurtenance thereto, and authorize the Board of Selectmen to acquire by gift, purchase, or otherwise land or rights in land within said way as so laid out for all purposes for which public ways are used in the town of Walpole. Do we... this is a petition of the Board of Selectmen. Mr. Stas, the Finance Committee vote.
Favorable action 900.
Thank you, Mr. Stas. Mr. Kraus, Board of Selectmen.
Favorable action 500.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus. Any questions or comments with regard to Article 29? There being none, this requires a simple majority vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? It is a unanimous vote. Article 30, Daylily Lane acceptance. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town vote to accept Daylily Lane from its beginning to its end, including any easements and utilities appurtenance thereto, and authorize the Board of Selectmen to acquire by gift, purchase, or otherwise land or rights in land within said way as so laid out for all purposes for which the public ways are used in the town of Walpole. This is a petition of the Board of Selectmen. Mr. Stas, the Finance Committee vote.
Favorable action, 900.
Thank you, Mr. Stas. Mr. Kraus, Board of Selectmen.
Favorable action 500.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus. Are any questions or comments with regard to Article 30? There being none, this motion requires a simple majority vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? It is a unanimous vote. Article 31, Redgate Road Acceptance. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town vote to accept Redgate Road from its beginning to its end, including any easements and utilities appurtenance thereto, and authorize the Board of Selectmen to acquire by gift, purchase, or otherwise land or rights in land within said way as so laid out for all purposes for which public ways are used in the town of Walpole. This is a petition of the Board of Selectmen. Mr. Stas, the Finance Committee vote.
Favorable action, 900.
Thank you, Mr. Stas. Mr. Kraus, the Board of Selectmen.
Favorable action 500.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus. Any questions or comments with regard to Article 1? There being none, Article 31, excuse me. There being none, this motion requires a simple majority vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? It is a unanimous vote. I'm going to propose, because it is just before 9, that we take a 10-minute break and come back at 9:02. Give or take a minute. Please take your seats and let's quiet down, please. Get it back together. All right, thank you. Up now is Article 32, the Wetland Protection Bylaw. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town vote to amend Section 561 of the General Bylaws. Wetland Protection Bylaw is set forth in the warrant under Article 32. This is a petition of the Conservation Commission. Mr. Stas, the Finance Committee vote.
Favorable action, 1201.
Thank you, Mr. Stas. 1201. Mr. Kraus, Board of Selectmen.
Favorable action 400.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus. Are there any questions or comments with regard to Article 32? There being none, this requires a simple majority vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? It is a unanimous vote. Article 33, zoning moratorium. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town take no action. This is a petition of the Economic Development Commission. Mr. Stas, the Finance Committee vote.
No action, 1200.
Thank you, Mr. Stas. Mr. Kraus, the Board of Selectmen.
Favorable action 400.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus. Mr. Hassenjaeger.
Hassenjaeger, Precinct 1, Economic Development Commission. This article was drafted, some of you may know, the Economic Development Commission represents about 200 businesses here in town, and these people have invested tens of millions of dollars, and the zoning is very important to this commission and them continuing to run their business and invest in Walpole. At the time the warrant closed, there was no planner, no community development director in town. Town Hall had not developed any zoning articles or changes. The people who should develop, an administration, the planning department, we didn't have one, engineering, building department. And there were placeholders for nebulous zoning changes. So we voted to suspend any zoning changes till we get a new planner on board, a new community development director, have the town employees that we spend $60 million for these professionals to develop the zoning changes and present them to this body in an orderly way in the fall town meeting like they're supposed to. So that's the purpose of this article. And we could not get any details. We think it's wrong to have last-minute zoning changes, spot zoning changes that are not well vetted, thought out, are not sponsored by the town departments, and are sponsored by individuals. And we think that if we have a comprehensive zoning review for the fall, our town professionals can do a better job, and we do have staff on board. Even in the interim, when we did get a community development person, we asked if it was feasible to study some of these articles and really analyze the impact on the community between then, which I believe was March, and now, and the answer was really no. So we'd appreciate this town meeting. Again, the 6-month term would be from January 23rd to July 23rd. It would just suspend zoning changes till our next town meeting, and it would give these staff in Town Hall the chance to do a proper set of zoning changes that would be more comprehensive and not piecemeal.
Thank you, Mr. Hassenjaeger. Any other questions or comments? There being none, this motion is for no action and requires a simple majority vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? It is a unanimous vote. Article 34, zoning amendment, schedule of dimensional regulations renumbering. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town vote to amend the Walpole zoning bylaw is set forth in the warrant under Article 34. This is a petition of the Planning Board. Mr. Stas, the Finance Committee vote.
Favorable action 12-0-0.
Thank you, Mr. Stas. Mr. Kraus, the Board of Selectmen.
Board of Selectmen voted favorable action 4-0-0.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus. And Mr. Conroy, the Planning Board.
Planning Board voted 5-0-0 favorable action.
Thank you, Mr. Conroy. Any questions or comments with regard to Article 34? Mr. Hasenjager.
Mr. Moderator, this article would be out of order since we just voted to have no zoning changes till in 6 months.
There was no action on Article 33.
I heard a favorable vote for.
I stated very clearly that the vote was for no action. That was the motion of the Finance Committee and the motion of the Board of Selectmen. Any further questions or comments with regard to Article 34? There being none, this motion affects the change to our zoning bylaw, so it requires a 2/3 vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? No. It is a vote. I declare 2/3. Before we start on Article 35, we have a presentation from the Walpole Housing Partnership with the chair and the vice chair coming down front here.
Hello.
I believe this is under Article 1, the presentation.
Yes, Mr. Johnson.
There it is.
You got it? Okay.
No, the next one below it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Audrey Grace. I'm the vice chair of the Walpole Housing Partnership. This is Andrew Flowers. He's the chair of the Walpole Housing Partnership. Our other members are Phil Zakrowski, Mike Thiele, Willa Bandler, and Jean Nicola. And where our role is, next slide, please. Our role is we're a selectman-appointed committee, and we're working with the Board of Selectmen and the Planning Board to develop policies that promote affordable housing, and doing so reducing the town's exposure to 40B developments. Our short-term goals are to update the housing production plan. It expires in December 2018. We're also looking into ways to apply for state funding through the Governor Baker's Housing Choice Initiative program, and to review Walpole zoning bylaws for a way to increase affordable housing. Next slide.
So what is affordable housing? I want to be very clear. Affordable housing isn't public housing. It isn't subsidized housing. It isn't some housing voucher from a federal program. Affordable housing is market rate housing that meets this criteria. It's a little complicated, but we're going to break it down. So think of households whose income is at or below 80% of the typical income for the Boston metro area. And for those households, given their income, if they can spend 30% or less of their income on housing, then that would be considered affordable housing. So next slide. Here's some numbers. The median family income, again, this is for the Boston metro area, because that's how the Department of Housing and Urban Development defines affordable housing. For the Boston metro area, the estimate for 2018 right now is about $108,000. So 80% of that is about $86,000. So break it down, monthly cost. And this is not just rent, but utilities and so on. It's about $2,200 a month to rent a 3-bedroom apartment in the Boston metro area. That is affordable housing, $2,200 a month. But what if you want to buy? This is a complex calculation that assumes a 5% down payment. It assumes homeowners insurance, real estate, property taxes. The estimate for affordable housing of buying a home, a 4-bedroom home, is about $286,000. So think of affordable housing as someone who's making $80,000, looking in Walpole for a home that's about $250,000, or for rent of, say, $2,000 a month. That's affordable housing.
Next slide, please. So why does affordable housing matter? Well, affordable housing is just generally good for the community, for any community. There's young, specifically in Walpole, there are young people who grew up here, and there are town employees who do not have many housing options in this town. Additionally, we have senior citizens who do not have many housing options in this town. That's why affordable housing matters. There's also a housing crisis in general in the greater Boston area. Our children can't live here. People who are town employees, like our police and fire department employees, cannot afford to live here. Our school department employees cannot afford to live here because we just don't have affordable housing in Walpole. Additionally, 40B development. So basically, the state, 40B, for many of you who probably already know this, but it's a state law that allows for developments that can bypass certain zoning bylaws, rules and regulations, when they include a percentage of affordable housing, all right? So some developers can work with the zoning board and the board of selectmen on these projects, but the town generally has very little control of if we're under our 10% affordable housing number, which Walpole is. That means the town can lose control over the development of its future, right? So this includes zoning and density requirements. Next, same slide.
Yeah, same slide. This third point, I think, I really want to emphasize business development. You see, there was a Sunday Boston Globe story just a few weeks ago. It cited several studies by Boston area chambers of commerce. So these are business groups that are citing the scarce housing supply as a big impediment to economic growth. And this is a real factor. Economic growth is constrained by high housing costs. If you want to attract workers for your business, it's hard to do so when the area is so expensive. Next slide. So here's some data we put together showing Walpole and neighboring towns. And this is the share of housing units that are deemed affordable, using that threshold we just discussed. And it's across 2 different dates in time. In the blue line, you're going to see 2014 numbers, and in 2017, we have those numbers in the red bars. So Walpole has barely made progress on this front. We went from 5.2% to 5.4% over those 3 years. But look at some surrounding towns: Foxborough, Westwood, Sharon. They're above 10%, and they just got there recently. So I'm optimistic. This is a serious problem, but it's solvable. Think of Norfolk, though. Norfolk has numbers below us, and they are getting picked apart by 40Bs. And that's why Walpole is a prime target for 40Bs. So these numbers, though, will change in the future because we have so much growth coming downtown. We mentioned, everyone's aware of that. But also because the decennial census in 2020 will change the denominator of the housing units that determines these calculations. So keep all those things in mind. Next slide.
Excuse me,
If I may indulge you for
one
2
moment.
more.
The 5 minutes has passed. How much time do you have left, and does this body want to extend? Extend. Could I please have a vote to extend their time limit? Yes. All those in favor? Opposed? Go ahead.
Thank you. I'll do this quickly. So why is Walpole behind in our 10% requirement? Well, we just don't have enough housing units in general in Walpole, and just a lack of housing stock overall. And that's what the Baker's Housing Choice Initiative serves to solve, right? By increasing housing stock, the reasoning is that will increase affordable housing. Additionally, we lack housing density. Our zoning bylaws, as they're written right now, only allow for denser housing development in certain districts, which are the GR and the business and central districts, and AQVs are currently allowed in many districts, and they can be denser than the typical residence, but otherwise our denser development is limited to those. And that's not a bad thing, right? So it's not bad for the ZBA to control how we develop our town and where we put denser housing development, so we make sure it's consistent with the neighborhoods in which they're developed, but it's also limiting locations for new denser development. And so this leads to the next 2 points. Development in the general residence district, which is in the business district and central business district, which is zoned to allow for denser development, has been constrained by moratoriums on development. And we also have history in this town of Walpole of piecemeal changes to the zoning bylaws. We tend to pick apart at them one by one without looking at the bigger picture, how it affects our town's development as a whole. And so, for example, we've been limiting denser development in areas where it would be consistent with the neighborhood because of denser development. And by doing so, we open ourselves up to 40Bs in other neighborhoods where denser development may be inconsistent. And so development moratoriums also are just bad for, or building moratoriums are bad in general for our ability to get grant funding. For example, there's grant funding out there, so we could have had money to pay for our housing production plan update, but because we have moratoriums in place on building, we were not eligible for that funding. Also, under the Baker's Housing Choice Initiative, we could be eligible for up to $500,000 in funding to increase our housing stock, but we're not eligible for that because we have moratoriums on development right now in this town. Next slide.
This is our final slide here. Just to conclude, so what do we do? And I'll be honest with you, we're still studying this. We have the Walpole Housing Partnership Committee has some residents from a diverse set of backgrounds and experiences. We're still exploring options. We're reaching out to other towns. We're working with the new town planner, Tim Higgins. We're hoping to work closely and learn from the planning board. So we're still studying different solutions. We just got this reconstituted a few months ago. So we hope to report back and report to the Board of Selectmen about different ideas and have a full and clear hearing about them. But what do we know? We know what's coming. Affordable housing is going to come here whether we like it or not through 40Bs. And no one likes a 40B that's unwelcomed. So what are options to increase affordable housing and hopefully gain control over this town's developmental destiny, not be imposed by 40Bs? What are those options? We could solicit friendly 40Bs. We could encourage zoning, as Audrey said, for denser development. We could also apply for state funds. And so in conclusion, access to affordable housing, it is a real problem for Walpole, but it's solvable. But we need to start acting now. And demographic trends are pressuring us. Baby boomers are retiring. They want to downsize. Their kids, millennials, are having fewer kids and want to live in denser, more walkable areas. But not only is there not enough housing, there's not enough types of housing: condos, duplexes, apartments. The single-family home-only mentality, I think, is something we need to grapple with. It's always going to be the majority of homes in this town. Always, it will be. But we need to be open to other types of housing. So we can do this. Other towns have. Thank you for your time, and we hope to report back to you in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Flowers and Ms. Grace. Okay, Article 35, the zoning amendment on age-qualified village amendment. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town vote to amend the Walpole zoning bylaws as follows. By changing Section 10C, age-qualified village, to special permit required, AQV 10-acre lots, A, site requirements, 2, but that's a tough one to read. From zoning 10C 2A2 zoning district, an AQV shall be located only in residential B, RB, general residential GR, business B, limited manufacturing LM, and highway business HB districts, and rural R district contiguous to the highway business HB district. 2, from 10C2A2 zoning district, an AQV shall be located only in residential B, RB, and general residential districts GR. And I'm not going to try to read the tables. It was hard enough to read that. But the tables basically are consistent with what I've just read and maybe actually easier to view. This is a petition of the Planning Board. Mr. Stas, the Finance Committee vote.
Finally, after a few tries, 11-1-0. Favorable.
11-1-0?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Stas. Mr. Kraus, the Board of Selectmen vote?
Yeah, the Board of Selectmen voted 4-0-0 to refer this back to the committee. We didn't feel we had enough information to make an appropriate vote.
Mr. Conroy, the Planning Board.
Planning Board voted 3-0-0 favorable action.
Thank you, Mr. Conroy. I just want to remind folks the main motion is the Finance Committee's favorable vote. Are there any questions or comments with regard to Article 35? There being none, this motion affects the change. Oh, excuse me.
Sorry for getting up so slowly.
It's quite all right. Could you just...
Basevich, Precinct 2. I'll make a comment on this particular article, but I think the comment applies to any number of other articles that we've considered. Maybe it's just me, but I have no idea what I'm actually being asked to vote on here. And it would be tremendously helpful. It would be tremendously helpful after we go through the required language if there would be someone who would say, okay, here's what we're really talking about. I know that will be helpful to me, not simply on this article. I think perhaps it would be helpful to others as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Basevich. And Mr. Conroy is going to take care of that. Mr. Conroy.
Sure. What I've said before to the FinCom and everybody else, the AQV goes back, Age Qualified Village, back to a private petition, Omega Associates, back in the late 90s. They had the land where now Riverview, or Riverwalk is. It was the old Bird Mills. And they decided they wanted to turn it into housing. So they're the ones that proposed this. And one of the things at the time, there was a sticking point about age qualified, 55 years old. Are we being prejudiced against it? And no, the government allowed you to do it. So this came in by a private developer who wanted to take the old Bird land. Well, we had a lot of substandard land back then. And the next one that was the article was actually crafted. You had to be 1,000 foot from a railroad. Well, it turned out the Lapa Pond met that too. And what the Lapa was an old sawmill. So what you saw is a lot of these old mill sites that weren't used. No one was ever going to build a new facility there. So they saw an opportunity to sell this land and build some housing. Well, that's how the AQV got, and we've had a few more since. What's happened here, though, is, and I'll give credit to Joe Moraski, is he said, okay, we have our 15, but let's stop losing some of our commercial business land to AQVs, and let's pull it back on the 10 acre. So that's what we're doing. Now we're going to have, if you have a 10 acre, we're trying to keep you away from all the wide open land that we wanted in the business and kind of pull it back to the residential. So that's kind of the history in the AQV, and we're just adding this section to give another, so that we're not going to get really nailed. There's still a lot of nice parcels out there business-wise, and we all know we'd rather get money from taxes on business a lot better than taxes on housing because it doesn't cost us. We actually make a profit, so to speak, on that. So that's how this all come about. So that's all we're doing here, the planning board, is just to make an AQV of 10 acres or under. We're taking it out of the, like I said, the highway business and all that, what you can do right now with the other, actually that's not even, should be moved over, but that's what we're doing. We're just trying to take it out of the commercial, nothing more.
Thank you, Mr. Conroy. Ms. Hamilton.
Hi, Ms. Hamilton, Precinct 2 and FinCom member. I'm just kind of looking for clarification.
Could you pull the microphone
Yeah.
a little closer?
Sorry.
There you go. Thank
Can you
you.
hear me now? Was it brought to to the body's attention that this was a substitute motion? So there is confusion because it is different than what is in the books.
That is correct. It is different from what's in the books. There was originally a change made to the 15 acre in the table that was unintentionally, and it was a typo, and it changed that, and that was out of scope of the article.
Right, and I have had the pleasure of having those presented to me probably about 3 or 4 times being on Finance Committee in our vote tonight. But it would go to the last speaker who also spoke about the confusion. So to make sure that the body knows that this is a new substitute motion that includes the 10 acre AQV as well as the 15 acre AQV.
So just to, excuse me, this is the main motion, because
Yes.
this is what was, so it's not a substitute motion.
It's not a substitute, okay.
This is the main motion that was put forth. My apologies for interrupting. Go ahead.
No, that's okay, but just clarification that it is different from the book, and what is the difference from what is in the book to what we're looking at now as a new main motion.
Thank you. Ms. Khatib.
Hi, Sarah Khatib, Precinct 8.
also Planning Board. Just as a point of clarification so people understand what they're voting for. So what this article is proposing is to no longer allow age-qualified village in several districts. That would be the business district, limited manufacturing, highway business district, and rural district contiguous to highway business district. So if it passes, what it means is that age-qualified villages would no longer be allowed in those districts. There are some age-qualified villages currently that are in those districts, so you know, there's no major problem there as far as I can tell, but just as a point of clarification for what you're voting on.
Thank you, Ms. Khatib. Ms. Grace?
Audrey Grace, Precinct 6. To the Planning Board, if someone could speak to this, but are there businesses that want to develop in these open spaces? And it seems like we're limiting the places where we can have AQVs to very limited areas. If someone from the Planning Board can speak to that through you, Mr. Moderator.
Mr. Conroy? Mr. Conroy, you can come down front, or you can stay there. Either one's okay.
You don't want me down front? Okay. I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
I'm sorry. Are there businesses that are in need of space in the business district, limited manufacturing and highway business district, and rural districts contiguous? I guess that's not for businesses. But are there businesses that want that space, or are we just preventing good residential development in these areas?
Well, what we're doing is, this was, like I said, was proposed by a developer. This wasn't a town-wide thing that was voted back in the late 90s. This was somebody wanted to make a buck, and that's what they narrowed it down to, because that's the land they had. What makes sense, and this has been hanging around for a long time, what makes sense is you don't put residential. That's why I have a commercial and we have residential, and that's what we're trying to do. Just pull it out where it needs to be. That's all. Everybody wants to, right now, the big deal is to cash in on the housing, but we also need the business, the income from that, and that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to correct something that was back, you know, almost 20 years ago now, that where you had some substandard land. But what's left now is decent stuff that's going to generate some income for the town, and that's all we're trying to do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Grace. Mr. Senna?
Vic Senna, Precinct 8. My question through Mr. Moderator, is this going to be deed restricted for only 55, or will it be allowed younger people to move into these units if they don't sell?
Mr. Conroy?
Right, we're not changing that. What they are is they are deed restricted. That's the only way you can do this as an AQV, is you have to be 55 years or older, and that was, I don't know if it's a federal law or state, but at the time it was explained to us, you could set it at 55. So if you're going to buy the house, you're going to buy the condo, you have to be over 55. But that doesn't mean is if you get someone dies and they're under it, they're not going to kick you out, but you just can't purchase a house if you're not at least 55 years of age. And that's in the deeds.
Thank you, Mr. Conroy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Senna. Mr. Moraski?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Moraski, Precinct 8, and a member of the Planning Board. Maybe I can give the town meeting some background information, more background information on this article. Walpole currently has 3 permitted age-qualified villages. They are Riverwalk Commons on Rose Court Way and Riverwalk Lane in East Walpole. There's 45 units there. Delapond Village on Delcourt Drive, Marissa Lane, and Olivia Terrace off of Stone Street, 42 units there. And Brookside Village on Fillmore Lane off of Route 1 on the same side and near the entrance of the Preserve Apartments, and there's going to be 30 units there, and that's currently under construction. Riverwalk and Delapont were built a while back. I think it was somewhere around 2002, 2003. It might have been even before the housing bubble. It might have gone to 2005. Brookside was permitted not too long ago, I think maybe before I got on the planning board, so I'm in my second year, and that's under construction. Units are being sold. I did have an opportunity to go down there and look at the construction, and I was told that people from Walpole, Westwood, Sharon, and even the state of Maine have purchased units there. All the AQVs are the so-called 10-acre projects allowed under the provision of Section 10C2 of the zoning bylaws. No AQV has yet to be permitted under the so-called 15-acre project, which is allowed under Section 10C6. However, as town meeting, many of you members know, Pulte, the National Home Construction Company, filed an application with the planning board for a special permit and site plan review for a 15-acre project consisting of 186 units at the site of Walpole Woodworkers, and the Pulte public hearing has been opened and has been continued. It is continuing before the planning board. Now, all 4 AQVs approved by or pending with the planning board were built, are being built, or...
Excuse me. Point of order, Mr. Hassenjäger. I don't have 3 minutes. You have 20 seconds left according to my clock, and I think I started it on time. So, but because he's been interrupted now, would anybody like to allow Mr. Moraski to continue? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Mr. Moraski, go right ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Thank you, town meeting. Could use another 7 hours, but... So no AQV has been permitted under the so-called 15-acre project, which is allowed under Section 10C6. And Pulte has come in, they're still before us. Now, all 4 AQVs approved by or pending with the planning board were built, are being built, or are proposed to be built on commercial land. Riverwalk was built on commercial land. It was zoned limited manufacturing. Delapond Village was built on commercial land. It was zoned limited manufacturing. Brookside Village is being built on rural district contiguous to the highway business district, basically on land that could have been zoned because it's next to the highway, could have been rezoned commercial land. And Pulte obviously wants to build with what's called Worthington Green on limited manufacturing land currently occupied by the Walpole Woodworkers. So you have 117 units in 3 10-acre AQVs and 186 coming online in 1 15-acre AQV if Pulte is granted its special permit, for a total of 303 total units. This isn't the first time that the town has allowed residential development on commercial land. This has been going on for some time, and I think some of you who have been around for a long time would recall that Indian Estates was previously rezoned to residential from limited manufacturing at the request of the property owners. And now there are approximately 200 houses there that were built by Toll Brothers, another national developer. And apparently, the desire to build AQVs on limited manufacturing is going to continue, because we are hearing unofficially through the grapevine that another 100-unit AQV may be coming our way. Now, the article before you is not a new idea. The article was going to be introduced in the 2017 Fall Annual Town Meeting, and it was being introduced as a result of the master plan findings and recommendations. However, at that time, we were encouraged not to put the article on the 2017 Fall Annual Town Meeting warrant because it could have caused confusion with the Board of Selectmen's article on the 15-acre AQV, for which Pulte has now filed an application and an application for site plan. Now, I mentioned the master plan. I want to go back to that master plan because it's the document by which we operate. The top 4 issues in the master plan facing Walpole future which is based on townwide meetings, townwide forums, and especially townwide surveys to citizens. All the citizens in Walpole got a survey and a big sampling responded to it. Number one issue, tax burden. That is your number one issue. Number two, the need to attract new business. Three, the need to protect our drinking water and supply, quality and supply. And four, the need to preserve school quality. Our fellow citizens want commercial tax revenue to stabilize the real estate tax bill. You cannot get more commercial tax revenue if we continue to let commercial land be swallowed up for residential use. Now, from fiscal year 2000 to fiscal year 2018, the number of residential single-family dwellings in Walpole has increased each year from 5,819 to 6,548, an increase of 729. However, since fiscal year 2010 to fiscal year 2018, the combined number of commercial and industrial properties has decreased from 521 to 481, a decrease of 40. Now, these 481 commercial properties are paying the higher of two tax rates. On average, in fiscal year 2018, they experienced a much higher increase in their fiscal year 2018 tax bill than residential properties experienced. If less and less commercial taxpayers pay more and more taxes, they will either leave Walpole or they'll ask the selectmen to lower the dual tax rate, which is currently 1.275. If the selectmen lower the tax rate, or even if the residential properties will obviously pay more. And if the selectmen ever decide to go back to a single tax rate, on average, the residential increase for fiscal year 2018 would have been, on average, $596. It was already $270 on average. It would have increased to an additional $326. Now, I'm going to take a wild guess here, and based on just what I know looking at the budget. I would say, looking at an $87 million budget, the commercial tax base is paying, and I would hope that the Director of Assessing would confirm this. My guess is that $12 million is being paid by the commercial. And if that's the case, and we ever went to a single tax rate, you would feel it like an override, the biggest override we ever had just passed, and nobody voted. So that's the purpose of this article. I want to invite more commercial into Walpole and work with economic development and the Board of Selectmen on a shared economic vision. And we can't do it without that. And before I just stop, Mr. Moderator, I had two slides. I don't know if they're available on Article 35.
Yeah, I'll allow
That's not really one of them, but... Oh, well, I had hoped that the article, the slide that we had, Foxborough has a town meeting, I believe, next week. They have an article on there with 30 provisions on it. I had a meeting with Duncan Page, their planner, and I've had a long conversation with her, sharing ideas and whatnot. But they have an article with 30 provisions on it, and that 30 provisions has the opportunity to create a lot of commercial buildings on the other side of Route 1, on the Walpole side, across the street from the stadium. I saw, if you go on the Foxborough site, the town of Foxborough site, the planning department, and look at their PowerPoint presentation that I guess they'll show to their town meeting. Oh, there we go. Check this out. We're talking about a building across the street where the casino went that's 135 feet high. That's at least 13 stories. A story is 10 feet. And there's another one that's 70 feet high. And you've got 7 buildings over there across the street. That proposed development, this is commercial development. That commercial development has the opportunity of generating $7 million in tax revenue. If we could just play off of that, we could make our tax base more affordable. And if we can make our tax base more affordable, maybe we would make our housing more affordable as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moraski. Mr. Hassenjaeger.
Yeah. Hassenjaeger Economic Development. Andy Basovich, I hope you're getting a little flavor now. The old town meetings used to be like that. We had a FinCom that would argue every article. Just a couple of points. It was a nice lecture on economic development, and I'm certainly supportive of the notions of rezoning land and creating more commercial opportunities. The facts are the sites that were mentioned sat dormant for decades. In fact, we were embarrassed by a company called Seabeans that moved out of Walpole. They looked for years across the river at the empty bird site, and they called it East Beirut instead of East Walpole. They actually made jokes about the vacant business land that no one would build on. And mixed-use development, I hold in my hand the Governor Baker's latest economic development plan for housing in Massachusetts. The #1 goal and objective of the state is mixed-use development. That's what banks will finance, and that's what businesses will go into. And we'd like to bring that in, and we just would not like to edge out the housing component on these large sites. The only large sites left in town are really going to be zoned business, and the housing component could be a very important part of it, and the AQV is the most profitable. Even the Economic Development Commission realizes that one of these properties cited is Riverwalk. Riverwalk generates more tax revenue for the town of Walpole than the H&V complex, the Walmart complex, and the old Kendall building. These HQVs are very profitable. Mr. Moraski was lecturing about taxes. They're very positive. They're not a negative thing. And we do need housing diversity, as the young folks mentioned in their talk. So I would encourage not to edge out the housing component and to get AQV out of the mix here. We want the business, we want the mixed use, but I think the housing diversity is an important component, so I would vote no on this.
Thank you, Mr. Hassenjaeger. Ms. Turco-Abady.
Katie Turco-Abady, Precinct 3, Planning Board. I get up in favor of this article. I think that we have 2 sizable apartment buildings being built downtown right now. It's likely that we have Pulte going into Walpole Woodworkers, and that's bringing a number of housing units. I don't think that goes unnoticed to the commercial base. I think that there are businesses out there who are going to hopefully come to Walpole and seek the business because we have grown. We will grow very quickly. I think that by giving up the commercially zoned land, it's a huge sacrifice. We won't get it back. I think we have to keep it, and we have to hope to increase that tax base and help all of our tax rates. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Turco-Abady. Mr. Hamilton.
Hamilton, Precinct 5. I support this article because town administration has convinced me that we make money on AQVs. Therefore, I'm in favor of it. However, I have one question. Will the deeds for AQV be in perpetuity?
I believe Mr. Conroy answered that question previously.
That's the way they have to be written, in perpetuity. They can always ask to come back, would have to come back to the town meeting, I believe. I think town council can rule on that. I did know of one such one up in either Marlboro or Hudson, they tried and the town meeting turned them down. But it's 55, that's it, perpetuity, you signed on for that.
Thank you, Mr. Conroy. Mr. Kraus.
Eric Kraus, RTM, Precinct 7. I do not have a vested interest in building houses in this town, but I do have a vested interest in raising our commercial tax base. And I just want to applaud Joe Moraski, Jack Conroy, and the Planning Board for their efforts behind this article. I will be voting favorably for this because anything we can do to raise the commercial tax base and lower the residential tax base is something we should take a good hard look at. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus. Mr. Pila.
Pila, Precinct 7. I'd just like to raise a question, a hypothetical. Mr. Conroy mentioned that, that the age-restricted housing was deeded, and that the only folks who could purchase those units are the people that are 55 years and older. The question that we should think about, and I don't have the answer, but I just want to raise it so that as you vote, you'll take this hopefully into consideration. Just because the deed says, states that it has to be, the buyers have to be 55 years or older. What happens, here's the question, what happens if there is no market for 55 and those units lay dormant and whoever the developers are, where is the money to come to pay their debt service, to satisfy their lenders? So again, I don't have an answer. I'm just raising the question that when you put restrictions on real property, it has benefits, but it also has some negatives. And I think that that needs a further debate or discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Pila. Mr. Trudell.
Trudell, Precinct 4, and Finance Committee. When you look in the WAN ads for real estate sales, houses always say great access to Route 1, 95, and so forth. It's like, yeah, that's what makes those locations great, which are all business district items. It's also what the businesses are looking for. So if we turn around and take our business development areas and say people want to live close to the highway so they can get to work, we're cutting down the prime commercial markets also.
Thank you, Mr. Trudell. Mr. Moraski.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Moraski, Precinct 8. Mr. Pila raised a great point about restricted housing. As part of my presentation, but I didn't give it, I go into a whole segment of population changes coming up and the decrease in the Generation X and millennials that are coming after the baby boomers. And I have articles that predict the next housing crisis because baby boomers won't be able to sell their homes or whatever. This is a real problem because before the housing bubble crisis, or during the bubble crisis, a lot of AQVs had to be repurposed. Nobody was buying them. So I know for a fact that in the town of Norton, Thorndike Development had to go Red Mill Village. They were building Red Mill Village. They had to go before the town of Norton and ask that their AQV age restriction be lowered to 50. And I have examples of other towns who have done the same. In response to Mr. Hassenjager's argument about all this money that we get from AQVs, let me give you the total assessment of all these AQVs that are currently occupied. In Della Pond, off of Stone Street, the total assessment is for all, for the 18 houses on Delcourt Drive, for the 16 houses on Marissa, and for the 8 houses on Olivia Terrace. They totaled $19,632,000 times a residential tax rate of $15.27. they produce an annual revenue to the town of $299,780.64. Now, I can take you down Norfolk Street to Rolls-Royce, and they're assessed at somewhere between $3.5 and $4 million. At a $20 commercial tax rate, they're paying $80,000 for being on 5 acres. I would rather take them and many more like them on limited manufacturing land because we don't know what the assessments of these AQVs are going to be. They could be below the average, they could be above the average. Mr. Hassenjager is correct about the AQVs on Riverwalk. They do produce, they do produce a higher assessed value. Those houses are assessed, total assessment of $24,812,100, and they produce a tax revenue of a little over $378,000 to the town. So there's some benefit there, but there is also a benefit
Mr. Moraski, your 3 minutes is up.
Thank you.
Mr. Hamilton.
Hamilton, Precinct 5. I still support this article, even though it may be repurposed. And I do that because putting it in residential areas and not in commercial would still be a tax benefit. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Mr. Abbott.
Bill Abbott, Precinct 6. I just have a comment or maybe a question. Some of these properties that are zoned for some sort of commercial activity, isn't the problem of where they're located? We'd have businesses if they were out on Route 1 or we had exits off of 95. It would seem that like our industrial road, production road, it's hard to get to. We don't have real good access, and I'm wondering if that's a problem with, I understand the concept of what we're trying to do here. It makes a lot of sense, but are we just going against the tide if our properties that are zoned for business are hard to get to, they will just lay vacant. I don't know if one could answer that. Maybe I have a wrong impression of some of these properties. Thanks.
Mr. Conroy, you want to try to answer that?
Yeah, I can try to answer it. One of the things everybody thought we were going to get the new Oracle, we're going to get new Amazon here years ago. We're not. We have like Class B warehouse type space. You have Industrial Road. You have off of Norfolk Street. You have U-Haul. You're going to get the people that don't need to be out on Route 1 paying the high price. You need the guys who need the machine shops, the guys who have the truck repairs, even the landscapers who need that type of stuff. You go down Industrial Drive, you go down there, you're going to have a paver. You're finally going to build this building soon. You have a former landscape supply house. So for those are the nice markets where these people can afford to be. If not, they're going to get pushed further and further. So it's not like you need the street traffic for these types of buildings. And that's what, if you go up Industrial Road, like I said, you have Fish Chemical and all those. They don't need to be on Route 1, and they don't need to be accessible to everybody. They just need a spot that makes sense for them, where the money's right to buy the land, and it kind of works.
Thank you, Mr. Conroy. Ms. Denizio.
Carrie Denizio, Precinct 4. I hear the arguments that we don't want to limit our commercial development in town, and they make sense to me. I just want to ask through you, Mr. Moderator, is the town in danger of, having a dearth of sites for commercial development? In other words, is this an urgent matter that we need to take this step now? Because if we don't, there won't be viable sites for further commercial development.
Mr. Conroy.
There's no imminent coming. What it was is when Joe got on the board, Joe's always a frugal guy, as most of you know, and he looked at it and kept saying, why are we chewing up residential land, commercial land for residential? And based upon the history of this was done by the developers who owned the Riverwalk. They didn't develop it, but they own that. So that's what they've come with, is to say, Joe wanted to pull out. It makes sense. Keep your commercial base and just move it over. And we're only talking 10-acre projects or less. So that's why he wanted to pull it back. There's nothing going to drop down on us.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Mr. Conroy. Thank you, Mr. Nizio. Mr. Snuffer.
Snuffer, Precinct 2, I move the question.
Who seconded that? Right. Thank you, sir. Mark Breen. Thank you, Mr. Breen. The question has been moved. This requires a 2/3 vote. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? It is a vote. The question has been moved. We will now vote on Article 35 as has been debated. This affects a change to our zoning bylaw, so it requires a 2/3 vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? It is a vote. I declare 2/3. Article 36, a zoning amendment for Section 6C4A. It is regularly moved and seconded that the town vote to amend the Walpole zoning bylaw is set forth in the warrant under Article 36. This is a petition of the Planning Board. Mr. Stas, the Finance Committee vote.
Favorable action, 7-5.
7-5. Thank you, Mr. Stas. Mr. Kraus, the Board of Selectmen.
Board of Selectmen voted favorable action 2-1.
Thank you, Mr. Kraus. Mr. Conroy, the Planning Board.
The Planning Board voted this article, which we sponsored, 3-2 favorable action.
Thank you, Mr. Conroy.
I'd like to explain this article.
You may proceed.
Okay. Most of you were here last year. This has been a long-winded one. Last spring, and then the fall was a private petition to put a moratorium on Section 6C. Okay, there's a moratorium that expires at the end of June. Planning Board took action. Have to do something. If not, it would go back to the way it was, which wasn't perfect. So we had a series of meetings, and we voted on this 3-2. We went from November, December, January, February. And what I'd like to say about this is the Planning Board took it upon themselves to create dimensional requirements that are in harmony with the general residents. And first off, I want to review what it doesn't change in the GR district. You still have to be connected to sewer and water. You still have to have 10,000 square feet per dwelling, and the frontage remains the same. What it's the added and the effect? Well, now we've put in you must have 2 or more dwellings per building. We have seen cases where one approved and one denied with single-family homes being constructed to avoid the subdivision control law. Okay? We've also seen that same typical thing if you go at the bottom of Stone Street and Clapp. When you see single families, it's a nice way for someone to get a small lot, 10,000 square feet. When you're in general residence, you have to have at least 15. So that's why we put it to 2 or more. 30-foot setback is to give relief to the abutters. You have a 30-foot setback anyway on your typical from your frontage and from your rear. We put this on the side, so it's a big, almost say donut of 30 feet. I might add that if you go to the section that we in Section 5 right now, if you're going to put a building up of 4 or more units, you have to have 50 feet from your neighbor. So this is not killing anybody. It's been rumored. All it is giving a nice little relief to the abutters. Another item in there was putting the buildings 30 feet apart. Very simple for doing this is now, if you have 2 buildings here, 2 units and 2 units, you can put 2 driveways there. So instead of driveways being out front, so you have 2 10-foot driveways, you got another 10-foot for some grass area. So that's the reason for the 30-foot apart. The 40,000 square feet is just simple math. This starts at 4 units or above, and if you go back to any of the what's already in there, you need 10,000 square feet per unit. So this isn't doing anything, it's just pointing it out. And now we also, the big part of this is it will require these types of, what do you call it, applications to go in front of the planning board for site plan. This will give us specific dimensional requirements that are non-existent presently. This change will make new projects look like the adjacent projects in properties in the general residence. The downside to not passing this is the ZBA will have no guidance over the dimensional requirements, as there are none. The upside for the abutters, the zoning board, and the developer is they know what they're going to get before they start. The upside for the town is also the planning board will be involved to ensure that the site plan, that it complies, and presently the planning board does have site plan for one building that will house more than 3 families as it's read, or 4 or more. So there's not many change there. We're just trying to be consistent, that's all this is. I will say it's a relatively simple change, and we had to do this because the previous building inspector had his interpretation, so we want to make it so that we get to where we all thought we were. That's all we're trying to do. That everybody, that whether you're building a single, multi-dwelling, or a bunch of individual buildings, they all conform to the same. This does not affect any commercial property or development, okay? There's nothing to do with commercial here. I've heard that before. Presently, we've had 4 types of these projects, one in Eastover across from the Woodworkers, one in Pleasant that's in court over density, one in Burns that was turned down. One of the reasons was density, and one in Stone Street that everybody's seen at the end of Clap. These projects were working under the existing rules, which basically there were none for all the reasons, all the problems. This change will allow full review, standard setbacks for a fair and reasonable project. And what this doesn't do, I know that there's been some stuff going around town that the world is falling apart for if the zoning goes through for any age-qualified village or condos, and that what would happen legally. And I would ask through the moderator that if our town council could speak to this to put at ease anybody out there, her legal opinion on this.
Town council?
Mr. Moderator, through you, the question is whether if a zoning provision is put into place that renders a structure or a use non-conforming, what protection is there for that structure or use? And there is statutory protection under Chapter 40A, Section 6. Any existing, lawfully existing use or structure that is rendered non-conforming as a result of a zoning amendment is allowed to continue to exist without any issue or problem. And in the event that there's any kind of casualty loss of a non-conforming use or structure, then there are specific provisions that allow for that use to be reinstated or the structure to be rebuilt as of right, exactly as it existed before, provided that it's done within a specific period of time. And under your bylaw currently, that's 2 years.
Mr. Conroy, before you continue, you're at your 5-minute limit. This body may extend for you if you all set.
I'm all set. I just wanted to just show everybody we're just trying to give some rules.
Yep. Yep. Point of order? Well, I know, but he's providing the planning board report. So I do have a substitute motion that's been submitted by Ms. Khatib and seconded by Mr. Kraus. This is to see if the town will vote to amend the Walpole zoning bylaws as follows. If you follow along in your book, you'll be able to determine the difference as I read through it. So I suggest if you have your warrant, you might take a look at it. And then Ms. Khatib will explain it to you as well. But I just want to pause for a second before I read it out.
It's noted on the back of the handout that I had.
So you have a hand, thank you, I didn't read. So it's on the handout, folks, but I will read it through just so you can take a chance to read it if you haven't had a chance to read it yourself. So it's eliminating the current section 6C4A and inserting a new section 6C4A. 6C4, number of buildings per lot. A, except where specifically provided elsewhere, in all residential zoning districts, not more than one principal building constructed as a dwelling or so used shall be located on each lot. However, in general residence districts, the Board of Appeals may, by special permit, allow more than one principal building on a lot, where the applicant has also shown that the design and placement of the buildings will be in harmony with the general character of the neighborhood, streetscape, driveways, building placement, setbacks, volume, and spacing. Each dwelling unit shall conform to the minimum lot area requirements set forth in the use table 5B13D, Roman numeral 4. Well, yeah. Applications for this special permit shall provide the information to the Zoning Board of Appeals specified in Section 2 of the zoning bylaws, and the information that is specified to be provided to the Planning Board required for a full site plan review as specified in Section 13 of the zoning bylaws. Said projects will be subject to all other applicable provisions of the zoning bylaws. 2, and by amending Walpole zoning bylaw Section 13, site plan review, adding a new subsection G to Section 13.2, applicability as follows. G, multiple buildings on a lot in accordance with Section 6C4A, or do or act anything in relation to thereto. Ms. Khatib.
Okay, thank you. Sarah Khatib, Precinct 8, also Planning Board. So I'm going to talk to you about zoning. It's very exciting. I know I'm not wearing a fun t-shirt tonight, but try to stay awake. First, I just want to state that if I am standing before you here, this body, recommending something, especially as it relates to a zoning issue, it's because I have studied the issue and I believe that the recommended change will serve Walpole well into the future. In fall 2017, town meeting passed a moratorium and remanded back to the planning board this section of the bylaw. I want to say just a few words on why I do not support the article as printed in the warrant. As proposed, the dimensional changes are overly restrictive, and also they will not definitively solve the special condition of multiple buildings on a lot. And while sincere effort and a lot of time went into writing the article, it has not been fully vetted, and full implications of its passage are still unknown. So essentially, what I'm proposing is that we keep the wording that was in the bylaw prior to the moratorium, with the notable exception of requiring that these projects go through the planning board for site plan review. And you can see the handout for a short explanation of what that means, site plan review. If you need a handout, I can pass more. As printed in the warranted, the article also requires that projects go through site plan review, but they added other dimensional requirements, and those, as I stated previously, are overly restrictive. And one thing, important thing to note is that the current process of these projects going through the ZBA is working. Recently, there were two different projects, that's Burns Avenue and McSherry, and they were denied a special permit under this section of the bylaw, as it was determined that they did not, in fact, meet with the character of the neighborhood in which they were proposed. So do I have ideas on how to modify those dimensional requirements? Yes, I do. And I did consider putting those ideas forward as a substitute motion. But in the end, I decided to take my own advice and to not try to negotiate bylaw changes on the floor of town meeting. So the motion before you adds site plan review. And that's an aspect that is supported by all of the planning board members. It is a necessary change, and it will serve Walpole well into the future. Truly, the best way to go about any kind of significant zoning changes is by conducting like a comprehensive review of the bylaw. We can look at it holistically. How does it impact different parcels of land? How do other departments feel about it? And then we can come before town meeting and confidently present those changes. So if there is the will from this body, I highly recommend that town meeting approve and fund a bylaw review at the upcoming 2018 fall town meeting. The town administrator has indicated to me that he would be in favor of this approach. This would be sound planning, and I hope all of us could support something like that.
Thank you, Ms. Khatib. Mr. Murtaugh.
John Murtaugh, Precinct 5. I commend the planning board so far for the changes, and I definitely have issues with the setbacks. A minimum of 30-foot setback shall be maintained for any building to any adjacent property line. That's in excess. That's 30 feet. Is way and above. Buildings shall be a minimum of 30 feet apart. That's in excess. I couldn't agree. That's way too restrictive. So I would second Sarah's proposal. I'd add to it. I'd say this Article 36 should be sent back to committee for further review and get it ready for fall town meeting. Thank you, Mr. Motherman.
Thank you, Mr. Murtaugh. Mr. Salvatore.
I just had a question regarding the substitute motion. It sends the minimum lot size back to the table itself. And perhaps Ms. Khatib can give me a little idea of, when you go back to the table, will that number be much less than 40,000 square feet per?
Ms. Khatib.
Thank you. The last line where it says each dwelling shall conform to the minimum lot area requirements?
Yes.
Yeah, so that basically, that was passed, not last town meeting, but the one before, but saying that per dwelling unit, you need to have 10,000 square feet. So if you want 3 dwelling units on a lot, so you'll need 30,000 square feet. If you want 5, you need 50,000.
Okay.
So it doesn't set a particular minimum lot.
I agree with Mr. Murtaugh that the current motion is overly restrictive. I stand in favor of the substitute motion, or alternatively, if the substitute motion doesn't pass, that we reject the main motion.
Thank you, Mr. Salvatore. Mr. Flowers. Mr. Mercedes.
Hello, Harry Mercedes, Precinct 8. I'd like to commend Sarah on her substitute motion, and I'd just like to ask a couple questions and try to look at it in a broad sense. So is it my understanding that, number one, this wouldn't cover anything going on in the rural zone?
Ms. Khatib, why don't you come down front for a moment while the question, I'm assuming they're going to be directed to you. You may answer.
Okay, thank you. So this particular section of the bylaw is only for the general residence district. That's the only place in our town that we allow more than one principal building on a lot, residential.
So my next question is, what we're hoping not to see on one lot is an 18-unit apartment building versus your lovely picture here of aesthetically pleasing, very nice, small community living. And I think the perfect example is what we see up on Maple Street on Route 27 in Medfield. I think everybody knows those different colored homes for Route 27. And that is the same type of project that we'd be looking at here.
Potentially. I mean, it would have to go through the ZBA, and if this passes, it would have to additionally go through the planning board for site plan review. But that is, potentially something that could happen.
And what it also does is it will put the power back into the zoning board and the planning board to make decisions for our town that make sense.
Right.
All right. Thank you very much. I like this article.
Thank you, Mr. Mercedes. Thank you, Ms. Khatib. Andrew, are you? Okay. Mr. Nordbach.
Okay. Dick Notabart, Precinct 7, former planning board member, FinCom member now. I stand behind Sarah on this and Mr. Murtaugh. I think an awful lot is at stake when we get into zoning. When I first retired in 2010, I was on the Master Plan Implementation Committee. And at that point, they were like 2 weeks away from installing all new zoning for the town. And I think with the help, I'm not sure whether Mr. Snuffer was involved in that, but I know the Board of Selectmen at that time saw the restrictions and the amount of multiplication that came out of making a couple small changes that made it difficult to understand and enforce. And I don't know all the details because I was brand new at that time. Here we are, 10 years later, and we're arguing and fighting about all this stuff. And it went on last year at the town meeting. I ended up with the flu, so I watched the rest of it on TV, and I was quite honestly shocked at what we were asking people to vote on when the people that really know what the articles are Joe and Jack, and Sarah's added some added value. I think John Murtaugh was a member for 3 terms, and he added value, and I'd like to add my 2 terms as some value to this too. But I would support the substitute motion. Doesn't mean I don't have respect for Jack or Joe. I just think the town needs to look at zoning a lot closer, and I would really call for a comprehensive plan that we work with the town administrator and the new town planner. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nordbart. Mr. Flowers.
Andrew Flowers, Precinct 4, Finance Committee. My view is that one of the main drivers of high housing cost is exclusionary zoning or zoning that prevents the needed development that the market demands. And that sounds like a pretty free market argument, and it is to some extent. And so applying that view here, and again, I really respect what Jack and Joe have done, especially when we get to Article 40 and so on. They've done great work on the planning board. I fully support Sarah's substitute motion. And the reason is, with that view of mine about exclusionary zoning applied to this issue, what's at stake here? The stakes are being muddied. On the one hand, people are saying this is about clarity. It's about giving clear dimensional guidelines where they didn't exist before. But I would argue that this is actually about density, because I think it was said earlier that this is a simple change. With all due respect, I really disagree with that. We've gone through 3 town meetings, and if it was a simple change, it wouldn't have lasted this long on this issue. Why is it not a simple change? Because this is the GR zone, and as Sarah said, this is the one zone in town where you can build multiple units, multiple buildings on a single lot. It's designed, it's basically downtown at East Walpole, it's designed to be the kind of higher density area of Walpole. And if you exacerbate the density issues, you're in this exact zone that was built for it, you're going to exacerbate the affordability problems I spoke about earlier. Well, how am and I'm claiming that you're exacerbating the density issues. The best definitive proof of this is David Norton, the building commissioner, speaking before the FinCom, and he was asked on March 26th or March 22nd, tell me how does 6C4A, this particular zoning bylaw in the GR zone, how does it changing before and after this Article 36? And he went through the setbacks, the sewage waters, the height, everything, and he's like, it doesn't change, and then he got to these dimensional these distance between the units, and they're increasing. And that's just the bottom line I want you all to take away from here. In the exact zone of town where we want to encourage density, we're forcing units to be built further apart. I support Sarah's substitute motion because I honestly think it's a good compromise. It gets at that first argument, which I disagree with, about that the problem here is clarity. It tries to add greater clarity, and it also brings in to the table the site plan review. That's something all 5 planning board members want. Jack and Joe, everyone wants that, so let's do that. And then second, I want to second Sarah's point about a comprehensive bylaw review. Again, I think that Joe Moraski has said this before, and I think 100% agree with him. He said, your zoning and your development is your economic development, is your business development. Zoning ties right into your commercial base. I 100% agree. That's why we got to get this right. We can't go about it in a piecemeal way. And if we keep restricting density, and I think this is what this article is going to do, we're going to be hit with 40Bs that we don't like and terrible density. So I oppose this article as it's written now, and I encourage people to vote for it, and I will support Sarah's substitute motion.
Thank you, Mr. Flowers. Mr. O'Leary.
Robert O'Leary, Precinct 3. A couple of clarifications I'd like to have, but I'd also like to make a comment on, I believe this article as written is a good article, and it should stand. But without limiting this, without restricting it, we're going to have questions that we had before, and I still have the same one before, common driveways. Somebody should speak on why common driveways aren't applying to multiple buildings on a lot. That, I'm still confused on why that's being ignored. That's one issue. As far as my clarification on the changes, one would be, how is upland being, how going to
Mr.
factor?
O'Leary, for 1 second, can I just have Ms. Khatib answer your common driveways question briefly and then have you continue?
I don't think this is a question for Ms. Khatib to answer. I think it's more of a
She's part of
town.
the planning board, and it's her substitute motion.
Well, let me make my clarifications first.
No,
if
you can
will.
continue. Go right ahead.
Since we're talking now with this article, 40,000 square foot area minimum, is that going to now be considered for upland? Is that going to now be considered that based on the 40,000 square feet, or is it going to be based on the zone it's in, meaning GR? That's one clarification that should be made on this wording on the article. The next clarification would be, it says here, number 3, a minimum 30-foot setback shall be maintained from any building to any adjacent property line. That's a minimum. Now, that can be increased to a 50-foot buffer, according to the bylaw change that
Mr.
we
O'Leary,
made.
I apologize. We're talking about Ms. Khatib's substitute motion, and those provisions are not within the substitute motion.
So do you want me to come back and speak about this after this?
Yes, we should wait till the substitute motion is addressed, unless you want to revise your remarks to talk about Ms. Khatib's motion.
Well, I'll just re-ask them.
Thank you. Mr. Moraski?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Moraski, Precinct 8. I just want to answer the question about density. If you look, the only way to answer it, Mr. Moderator, is to refer to the main motion, the current main motion, and that is that there is a provision in there that all proposed dwellings shall have not less than 2 dwellings per building. You know, at the time when we were writing this article, the governor was drafting, came out with his initiative that he presented to the legislature for municipalities to make some provisions for multifamily housing. So we use Section 6C4A to propel multifamily housing. So the issue of density, I'm a little confused about that, because under this proposal, you can actually build housing with shared walls. You can't get any more dense than that. The density, the connection between units is 0. So, you know, and the other issue that came in was, you know, let's give it back to the ZBA, let the ZBA make the decision. Well, this is the issue. You know, ZBAs are appointed, ZBA members are appointed by the Board of Selectmen. ZBAs change. One day you could have a ZBA that says the characteristics of a neighborhood are an important factor in determining whether to implement Section 6C4A. The next day you got 5 new members, they may dispel that. They may just say that doesn't count. So, you know, I think standards are very, very important. And I think the problem that we're having here, you know, in terms of a total rewrite, now, I mean, I offered to sit with Liz Dennehy when she was the Economic Development Officer and go through the entire zoning bylaw book. It's about 177 pages, and see what we could do to rewrite those sections that needed to be rewritten. But, you know, without her and without any, you know, volunteer effort, that to do something like that would probably cost a couple of $100,000. So the problem here, though, is that this section doesn't exist anywhere else. This is an anomaly. This just pertains to Walpole. How this got into our zoning bylaws, I do not have any idea, and I don't want to know. All I do know is that we've spent a fortune in legal bills, a fortune in staff time, going over applications for special permits and site plans. We have caused our residents and our taxpayers to spend hundreds of hours away from their families so they can go to the ZBA, the Conservation Commission, the Sewer and Water Commission, the Planning Board, back and forth from one committee to another for years. You know, what kind of sympathy do we have for these people where they have to do that work and bird dog people and bird dog committees in order to plead their case?
Mr. Moraski, your time is up.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Mr. Romeo.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Not an RTM, but planning board member, one of the two that was not in favor of the original motion. One RTM came up during Article 35 and said, you know, this stuff is hard for us to understand. Can somebody kind of lay it out in layman's terms and tell us what the consequences of such a motion would be? So I'm going to try to do that a little bit for you. And I think the first place to start, if you have any feelings of ambivalence or not sure which way to go, the fact that Planning Board was 3-2 and Finance Committee was 7-5 and the selectmen were split right down the middle. I guess tie goes to the affirmative, but it was 2-2-1. There's a lot of questions about what the unintended consequences and in some cases the intended consequences of this article, the way it's written, are. So very quickly, I know I only have a couple of minutes. Looking at all proposed buildings shall have not less than 2 dwellings per building. My question during our meeting was why? What is the purpose of that? As Mr. Flowers and Ms. Grace very well laid out in Article 35, that flies in the face of every modern, high-value, high-density housing project in the country. Millennials are going to be buying these properties moving forward, and they have stated with many studies they don't want the 3,800 square foot colonial on an acre and a half. They want to live in small residential communities, single family, 2-family, mixed, walking communities, villages, and they're being built everywhere around us. And it's something that we need to pursue if we're going to become what we want to be with housing. So very quickly, and I'm going to jump ahead because I know that we're on a time limit here, but what is the reality of all these setback issues and the spacing issues? You can't see this because we were told we couldn't put up a slide, but that's okay, I'm going to explain it to you. This is a 40,000 square foot lot with the inner square being the setbacks. That is a standard sized 68 feet wide by 67 feet deep with the decks, 2-family. You can get one on this property with the rules that they're putting in. So what's a builder going to do? He's going to say, well, I'm not going to go through all this work just for 2 units. I'm going to build a 4-unit attached building. And without the option to do a village, a very well-planned, well-designed, well-thought-out village in general residence, we are going to become duplex and 4-family city. That's what East Walpole and the rest of general residence will become.
Mr. Romeo, your time is up. We have some folks that are asking for more time. All those in favor say aye. Aye. I'm opposed. No. Continue, Mr. Romeo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. I only have a couple more things. This is an actual project in East Greenwich, Rhode Island. They went through the same problem, but they didn't have the restriction on their bylaws. This was zoned differently. It was originally zoned for light manufacturing. What they did was they took what they had, they brought it to their planning board, and they changed it, they rezoned it as high-density residential, which is a special condition that can be brought to the board, a special request. And that's what Sarah is talking about, rewriting this article so we have the option, if appropriate, to build these very well-designed communities. They could have, with their current zoning, have put this monstrosity, I know you can't see it, it's 1 lot, very small, not even an acre, with an 8-unit monstrosity on it, 1 building. Instead, and it didn't fit in with the neighborhood. What they did was they deconstructed the multifamily, and they made a series of small cottages on that lot. And it sold out in about a week. What they did was, now let me give you the numbers on that. 39,000 square feet, so 9/10 of an acre. 15 cottages. They're all two-bedroom units at 900 square feet. They have singles, duplexes, and triplexes. Now again, because it was thought out, that's what they wanted. But under our plan, we could not offer this because we cannot do the single-family option, even if it's mixed. They put 17 units per acre. Now that's dense. I'm not saying that's for Walpole, but the fact is, it's a small walking community, common green, common garden, water management, and the way they laid it out, they have fire apparatus access, and it's a beautiful, modern community, and I'm telling you, it's being built all over the country. I don't know why Mr. Moraski and Jack are so against higher density in general residence. And Mr. Moraski is correct that you can't get more dense than a wall. The fact is, builders are going to build, developers are going to develop. We can steer what they develop and make Walpole wonderful, or we can make East Walpole a tenement. And it's really up to what you decide here. And don't misunderstand, I can be very dramatic. Anybody that knows me knows that Sarah's the brains and I'm just the excitable one. But the fact is, I believe this article will have the single most impact on the future of Walpole housing than any other article that I've ever seen. Now, I've only been coming here for 4 years, but this one, in my opinion, is the most important housing article that's ever come in front of this body. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Romeo. Mr. Gallivan.
Gallivan, Precinct 8, move the question.
Who seconded that? Thank you, Mr. Breen. Moving the question requires a 2/3 vote. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? It is a vote. We will now vote on the substitute motion to make that the main motion. And this requires a simple majority to make it the main motion. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? No. The ayes have it. Are there any more? Mr. Trudell.
One question where it's amending section 13, and it says under G, multi-buildings will be subject to basically the site plan review. Does that mean that if a person decides they want to build a duplex, that it doesn't need site plan review?
Mr. Conroy, or actually it's Mr. Conroy? Ms. Khatib.
So a two-family residence would be a different, it's under a different section of the bylaw. So that would have different requirements. I can look it up if you want, but I don't think it requires that.
Any further questions or comments? Mr. Moraski.
Moraski, Precinct 8. Just for clarification, Mr. Moderator, if the substitute motion, or just now the main motion.
Correct.
Passes, or doesn't pass, Section 6C4A, as currently written, will then remain intact.
Until the moratorium expires, Town Council?
Okay, so essentially
And then it would revert back to the prior language.
Right, which basically the only part in it that, if I recall correctly, does not include the planning board being involved in site plan review.
Yes, Mr. Trudell.
Actually, through you, if the substitute motion fails, it reverts back to the main motion, and that still has to get voted.
We're going to take a vote on the substitute motion. So it is now the main motion. Mr. Moraski, did you have more comments?
Yes. The issue that I have with the substitute motion is Well, the biggest issue here is not the 6 conditions that failed.
Mr. Moraski, we've voted on the substitute motions now, the main motion, so I just...
Well, the biggest issue I have with that is that it doesn't have the 40,000 square feet entry. There's only 14 lots that we're talking about in the GR zone that have vacant land on them, and 5 of them are buildable. The rest are possible buildable. So we're talking a minimal amount of lots. The thing is that why I wanted the 40,000 entry in there is because we have to worry about the tear downs. Tear downs would be the biggest, and that's what you saw on Stone Street. So I would recommend that we vote down this main motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moraski. Mr. O'Leary.
I just want to re-ask the question now on common driveways, why that doesn't apply to 64A, and also could the buffer be explained, the 50-foot buffer, when that will actually fall into play?
Town council is... One moment.
That would be within the substitute motion. It's the same answer as it's going back to the beginning.
Mr. O'Leary, the article is not speaking to common driveways, so we're not debating that, so I'm going to rule your question out of order.
I'd like to debate that because
Your
we're talking
question
multiple
is out of
buildings on a
order,
lot.
Mr. O'Leary,
Multiple
respectfully.
buildings on a lot.
The article...
That's part of 64A.
So, Mr. O'Leary, if I can just explain my reasoning again, the article is not speaking to the common driveway. It's not going to change it. I understand your question, but there's nothing in the article or the substitute motion, which is now the main motion, that actually deals with the common driveways and the definition thereof. That's why I've ruled the way I have.
Okay, what about the 50-foot buffer?
The buffer? You have a question on the buffer? That's been removed.
No more buffer.
Ms. Khatib?
The substitute motion doesn't have any particular buffer.
So it's removing the buffer that was put into place a couple of town meetings back.
I don't recall there was a buffer put into place. The main motion, or the article as written in the warrant, proposed a 30-foot buffer. The substitute motion that I put forward to this body does not have that 30-foot buffer.
I believe town meeting linked up the use table, which would link it up to the buffer.
Use table is different than the dimensional requirement table. They're 2 separate tables.
We did make that change.
Mr. O'Leary, I believe your question's been answered.
How could it be? No, it hasn't been answered.
The-
Is the 50-foot buffer going to apply to this bylaw as it is voted on or not?
Mr. Conroy, are you able to speak to the 50-foot buffer within the scope of this article? You can say no, Jack.
I'd just like to say, I just saw this substitute motion at like 7:30 tonight, so I have no idea.
Okay,
so I
thank
can't
you.
answer any of that.
Thank you, Mr. Conroy. Mr. Hassenjager, briefly.
I think that what he's referring to is a buffer that was put between business zone and residential, not...
So it's not part of this
not
article?
part of this article.
Thank you, Mr. Hassenjager.
Through you, Mr. Moderator, I was speaking to what town meeting put in place regarding a vacant lot or a single-family house that would abut a development pertaining to 64A, and that would link up when we put I into the use table in a previous town meeting.
Could you stand and speak to your point of order, please? Thank you. Mr. O'Leary, I believe your question's been answered and it's not applicable to the article. Thank you for your comments. Mr. Hamilton.
Hamilton, Precinct 5. I've witnessed many, many ZBA meetings where the residents have come in with projects similar to this, and special permits were issued by the ZBA that were very detrimental to the people who were the residents abutting these projects. So if the 30-foot buffer is going to be removed by this article, I will oppose it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. We have one more. Are there any other RTM members that wish to speak? Ms. Barrows, you may come down to the microphone and speak now. Well, I'm going to give Ms. Barrows her 3 minutes. She did come before. That's why I asked if any RTM members wanted to speak. It is within our town meeting rules. Ms. Barrows at the microphone right there, please.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I wasn't really expecting to speak to this substitute motion, but I do want to say that I feel as though if you took an example of 40,000 square feet, and as current guidelines in the table, it's 10,000 per unit, by taking away the setbacks between the building, you're allowing, if there are wetlands on the 40,000 square foot lot, you're allowing those units to be potentially 5 feet apart from each other. And that doesn't, it just doesn't prevent, it doesn't allow for any protection to the abutters. And what I also wanted to say was already addressed by town council, so thank you for letting me speak.
Thank you, Ms. Barrows. Any further questions or comments before we, yes, Ms. Khatib.
If I could just respond to that. So what the substitute motion is proposing is that these projects now go through the planning board for site plan review. So as I've outlined on my handout, some things that a developer would have to provide to the planning board and we would have to approve are things like lighting plan, drainage plan, signage, location of all water resource protection areas. So that gives the planning board some power, you know, to work with developers in ensuring that our, you know, natural resources are protected.
Thank you, Ms. Khatib. Mr. Conroy.
Quick question through you, Town Council. Substitute motion, will it pass the muster of the AG? Has this been properly through the planning board public hearing process, or will there be any issues, I should say?
Town Council.
Through you, Mr. Moderator, I understand that the moderator has indicated that the article is within the scope.
Yes, I have.
No, I understand. I'm just asking for the Attorney Generals, because they get to have their own little deal afterwards. What I'm trying to tell everybody here, whether you know I wasn't in support of it, but I want to have us go off and everybody approves it, and then find out 3 months from now the AG goes, doesn't work. Just want to make sure, that's all.
I don't think that the AG would overrule the moderator's determination that it's that the changes are within the scope.
Okay, within the scope, but I'm talking about the public planning.
And that's how they are
process.
within the scope.
Okay, just as long as you're all set.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Any further questions or comments? Okay, we will now vote on the substitute motion, which is now the main motion. As it's a change to our zoning bylaw, it requires a 2/3 vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? No. Standing. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? No. It is not a vote. I do not believe that is 2/3. That sounds closer to a minor majority to me, so it is not a vote. The motion has failed. Mr. Pila, yes, thank you for coming to the microphone.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I would ask for a standing vote.
I need that to be 7 other members to please rise. We have more than enough, thank you. Tellers, please. Are my tellers here that have not spoken on the article? I see Mr. Forsberg, Mr. Gallivan, all set. No, you moved the question of the substitute motion. Yep. So that, I don't think that's speaking. Okay, those in favor, tellers, please raise your hand. 4. Opposed? 2. And just for clarity, we're taking a standing count on the substitute motion, a 2/3 vote to pass. Okay, all those in favor of the substitute motion, please rise. I'm sorry, as the main motion. You know what, just for clarity, the center row should count down front. So if you've done that, please, okay. I should have clarified that, my apologies. So are we, Mr. Hegley, are we ready on the left?
5.
5 in favor, thank you. Mr. Gallivan in the center?
37 in the center.
Thank you, Mr. Gallivan. And on the right, Mr. Laurent?
29.
29, thank you. Please be seated. All those opposed to the motion, the substitute motion being the main motion, passing? Mr. Hagler?
4.
4 noes, thank you. Mr. Laurent, you can give your count if you're ready.
5.
5. Mr. Gallivan?
16 in the center.
Thank you, Mr. Gallivan.
Are you going to make me do math? Yeah.
Did you keep track?
So I was mistaken, Mr. Pila, good call. We've got 75 in favor, 27 against, 102 in total, so the motion is 2/3, it does pass. So I declare 2/3 vote.
Is that right?
Just before I do anything further, one moment here. I'm not sure if we have a few more articles to go, and they're zoning articles, and it's 10:57 p.m. by my clock. Before I entertain a motion to adjourn till next Wednesday night, I just wanted to confirm, Mr. Kraus, are you, not to put you on the spot, are you going to be available next Wednesday night? Okay, thank you. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
I would like to make that motion.
Mr. Salvatore, thank you.
Do
I have a second?
Can I take a second, just a second? I was a little concerned our meetings would never end as Mr. Deneen is convalescing at home. But in his honor tonight and hoping him well, wishing him well, I do make a motion to adjourn.
Do I have a second? A second. Mr. Kraus seconds. And thank you for those comments about Mr. Deneen. Well wishes. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed? It is a vote. We'll see you Wednesday night at 7:30.